Rest your mind and drift gently into the calm of the night. Tonight's journey takes us along the forgotten trade routes that once connected the world together. Dusty paths across deserts, winding tracks through mountains, and silent sea routes that carried more than just goods. They carried ideas, languages, and the quiet connections that shaped civilizations. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from. One of the quiet joys of this channel is hearing how far these journeys travel from one place to another, much like the routes themselves. And if this video helps you unwind, I kindly ask that you give it a like and subscribe for more of these calm explorations. To those already subscribed, thank you. You are the group that keeps this little journey moving forward. I do hope the video isn't so interesting that it keeps you wide awake, but if it does, at least you'll drift into tomorrow with a head full of new places, old paths, and perhaps the faint sound of camel bells or ship sails. So, let us begin. Have you ever wondered how roads that no longer appear on modern maps could once have carried the weight of empires and why their silence still echoes in the world today? Trade is as old as humanity itself. From the very first moment when someone traded a shiny stone for a piece of flint, or offered shells in exchange for food, people have been on the move carrying more than objects in their hands. They carried stories, knowledge, and habits that would spread into entire cultures. The trade routes of the ancient and medieval worlds were never just about goods. They were rivers of exchange shaped by geography and bound by necessity. Some of these routes remain famous. The Silk Road, the Spice Seas, names that still bring up caravans and sails in the mind. But beneath them lies another world. The lesser known, the overlooked, the forgotten. Roads of amber through northern forests, salt tracks crossing the Sahara, footpaths of incense winding into temples, or rope bridges hanging across the Andes. Each had its role in weaving together the human story, and each was guided by the quiet hand of mountains, rivers, winds, and deserts. What makes these paths so fascinating is not only what they carried, but how they reveal the world itself. Geography is always there, nudging the direction of movement. A pass in a mountain range might decide whether silk flows east or west. A monsoon wind can determine when cinnamon reaches a port. A harsh desert forces cleverness, creating cities at its edges that thrive on the thirst of travelers. Over time, many of these routes faded. Some were replaced by ships that could sail around continents, others by railways and highways, and still others were simply lost to memory. Yet in their quiet disappearance, they left behind marks. We still see words and languages, spices in kitchens, buildings in cities, and shared ideas that echo through religions, art, and science. Tonight's journey will not be hurried. We will move slowly as caravans once did, pausing to notice landscapes and the steady patience of those who crossed them. We'll trace the footprints of forgotten traders, the rhythm of sea waves that carried hidden treasures, and the faint tracks that lie buried beneath forests and sand. By the time we've wandered these roads together, you may find that the world feels at once larger and smaller. Larger because of the huge effort it once took to cross it, and smaller because of how closely connected it has always been. The forgotten trade routes remind us that even the quietest of paths can shape the destiny of nations. So as you settle into stillness tonight, imagine yourself stepping onto one of these faded trails. The dust of ages rises softly in the air. The horizon stretches wide, and the question lingers. Which forgotten road will we walk first? Long before the great caravans of camels padded across deserts, or the sails of spice ships caught the monsoon winds. There were smaller, humbler journeys, footsteps pressed into the soil by people who carried only what their arms or backs could bear. These earliest routes were not roads in the way we imagine them today. They were paths of convenience, trails beaten down by repetition, by the simple need to move from one place to another. Yet these faint tracks winding through forests and along rivers became the first threads of human connection. In the days when society still lived by hunting and gathering, exchange was already taking shape. Imagine one community near the coast with plenty of seashells meeting another farther inland that had access to obsidian, a volcanic glass sharper than almost any blade. A shell could be beautiful, but useless for cutting meat or scraping hides. Obsidian could be deadly sharp, but lacked the decorative charm of bright colors. When the two groups met one another, a natural bargain appeared. One gave what was plenty, and in return received what was scarce. From the simple act, the idea of trade was born. Geography decided everything. People living in river valleys often found themselves with fertile soil, good for growing extra grain, which became valuable for those in rockier or less generous landscapes. Communities near salt deposits, whether from dried lakes or coastal evaporation, held a resource that was not just useful, but essential. Salt preserved food long before refrigeration was imagined, allowing meat and fish to last through the winter. To those without it, salt was more precious than any jewel. Thus, a dusty path leading from a salty marsh to a mountain village was not just a trail, it was a lifeline. These early exchanges were not global networks, but they carried weight all the same. A polished shell might travel from one valley to the next, passed along by strangers who valued its beauty, until eventually it reached a place far from the ocean. Obsidian blades from Anatolia have been found hundreds of miles away from their volcanic sources, showing that even in the Stone Age, objects could outlast the footsteps of those who first carried them. The people themselves likely viewed these exchanges not as business deals in the modern sense, but as relationships. To give and to receive was to form a bond, to acknowledge connection. Some objects may have carried spiritual value as well as practical use. A bright stone from a distant land was more than decoration. It was proof that the world extended beyond the horizon, that other people lived and moved and carried their own knowledge. The roots themselves grew out of the land. Mountains forced travelers to follow valleys or riverbanks. Deserts required careful planning to hop between watering holes. Forests demanded paths cleared by repeated passage where footsteps gradually bent grasses and marked the way. The geography was both obstacle and guide, dictating where people could walk and where they could not. A cliff face stopped you. A river, if broad and calm enough, carried you farther than your legs ever could. What is striking is how these early movements shaped the beginnings of civilization itself. Farming communities emerged where fertile soil allowed crops to grow, but it was the ability to exchange extra grain for obsidian, salt, or livestock that encouraged stability. When people had more than they needed of one thing and less of another, trade created balance. It encouraged villages to specialize, some focusing on crops, others on tools, still others on fishing or herding. This quiet web of exchange gave rise to something greater than isolated groups. It created the first beginnings of connected societies. We sometimes think of prehistory as a time of separation, but the archaeological records suggest otherwise. Shells from the Mediterranean have been found in the heart of Europe, while tools made of Baltic amber traveled southward. These objects did not leap across continents in one go, but passed hand to hand, village to village, in what must have been a remarkably slow relay. It was trade without merchants, as we know them, without maps, without written records. Yet it worked because humans everywhere share curiosity and need. And yes, the speed was not exactly comparable to what we're used to today. Before modern shipping, before railway carriages, before the idea of two-day delivery, there was simply the long road, the long walk, the long wait. One might say that before Amazon Prime, there was simply the patience of human feet. It may not have been swift, but it carried a certain reliability. If you wanted obsidian and were willing to walk far enough, you could eventually find it. Even the animals of these landscapes played a role. Dogs may have trotted alongside hunters carrying packs, while in certain regions people learned to use donkeys and later camels as beasts of burden. Yet in the very beginning, everything was carried on human shoulders. A bundle of salt, a basket of shells, a sharp black stone, all carried across miles by persistence alone. The first footpaths of exchange remind us that trade did not spring suddenly into existence when empires appeared. It began humbly, quietly, shaped by geography and by the simple logic of human need. Step by step, these trails linked communities that might never have spoken the same language, but who understood value in the same way. They remind us that long before written contracts, there were gestures of trust, the giving of an object, the acceptance of another, the nod that said, "This is fair." In their own way, these early paths of trade were as important as any later highway or sea route. They carried not only goods, but the beginnings of human culture, a recognition that life was richer when shared. And though the paths themselves may be invisible now, overgrown by grass or buried beneath cities, the echoes of those first footsteps are still felt each time people gather in a market, each time an object from far away passes into someone's hands. It is part of a story that began when two strangers met at the edge of a forest, one holding a shell, the other a shard of glassy black stone, and both realizing they had something the other desired. Across the rolling sands of the Arabian Peninsula, long before oil wells and modern highways, there stretched a series of trails that shimmered with the fragrance of wealth. These were the paths of the incense route, a network of caravan tracks that wound their way from southern Arabia through the harsh desert northward to the Mediterranean world. What they carried was not gold or silver, but something that to ancient peoples was just as precious: the aromatic resins of frankincense and myrrh. To understand the allure of these goods, it helps to step back into the mindset of antiquity. The ancient world was filled with smells, many of them far from pleasant. Markets brimmed with fish, animals lived close to people, and sanitation was basic at best. To burn incense in a temple or palace was to create a small miracle. The air was transformed, purified, made otherworldly. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from hardy trees in the southern Arabian highlands, became essential not only for masking odor, but also for sacred rituals. In Egypt, plumes of incense smoke were thought to carry prayers directly to the gods. In Rome, temples could not function without it, and even funerals demanded the curling smoke of resin as a gesture of respect to the dead. The trees that produced these resins grew in a narrow belt of land in what is today Oman and Yemen, as well as parts of Somalia across the Red Sea. Harvesting them was laborious. Small cuts were made in the bark, and the tree's sap bled slowly, hardening into fragrant tears of resin that could be scraped off weeks later. These nuggets, pale and shimmering in the sunlight, were then packed up and made ready for journeys across hundreds of miles of forbidding desert. Here, geography dictated everything. The deserts of Arabia are vast, dry and punishing, but not featureless. Caravans traced paths that threaded through oases and wadis, those narrow riverbeds that filled only after rain, but still guided travelers across otherwise hostile terrain. Water was the true currency of survival, and knowing where to find it was as valuable as knowing the stars. The camel was the hero of the story. Domesticated in Arabia around the early first millennium BCE, camels became the ships of the desert. Their ability to go days without water, to carry heavy loads, and to plod patiently through scorching heat made them indispensable. Caravan trains could stretch for hundreds of animals, each carrying sacks of resin, salt, spices, or even textiles. Their padded feet left trails across the sand, invisible to outsiders but well known to those who had inherited the secrets of desert navigation. Along these routes, cities rose like mirages built on trade. One of the most famous was Petra, hidden among the red cliffs of modern-day Jordan. Approached through a narrow canyon, the city opened into a dramatic facade of temples and tombs carved directly into sandstone walls. Petra's wealth came not from conquering armies, but from its position as a crossroads. Caravans laden with incense, spices, and textiles would stop to rest, pay taxes, and trade. The Nabateans who ruled Petra became experts at water management, channeling rain into systems and reservoirs, ensuring that both people and animals could survive in a place where rain might not fall for months. It was ingenuity carved out of stone and necessity, all made possible by the flow of goods along the incense route. Other towns also flourished along the way: Gera on the Persian Gulf, Marib in Yemen, and Gaza on the Mediterranean coast. Each acted as a link in the chain, places where goods changed hands, where merchants rested, and where cultures mingled. Languages, religions, and ideas followed the same trails as the caravans. A Roman might encounter an Arab trader who had learned a little Greek, while an Egyptian priest could be seen purchasing frankincense carried on the backs of camels that had walked for months. The scale of demand was staggering. At the height of Rome's appetite, it is said that caravans carried thousands of tons of frankincense north each year. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, never shy of exaggeration, grumbled that Rome was pouring its wealth into Arabia's sands in exchange for smoke that vanished into the air. But this smoke was no small thing. Incense defined ritual, elevated daily life, and created a sensory bridge between humans and the divine. To burn frankincense was to take part in a universal act that stretched across empires and faiths. Of course, trade was not only about the goods themselves, but about control. Whoever commanded the routes controlled the flow of wealth. Wars were fought, alliances forged, and kingdoms rose and fell along the trails of incense. The Nabateans, with their mastery of desert travel, could guide caravans across landscapes that outsiders would find deadly. Their knowledge of hidden wells and seasonal rains gave them immense power. For centuries, they held sway until shifting politics and new routes began to eclipse their dominance. The geography that once sustained these routes also contributed to their decline. When maritime trade expanded, it became easier to load ships with resins at ports on the Arabian and East African coasts and sail directly to the Mediterranean. The sea could be treacherous, but it was faster and cheaper than trudging hundreds of miles through deserts where every drop of water had to be planned for in advance. Slowly, the incense trails fell silent. Cities that had thrived on caravan taxes dwindled, and the great trains of camels that once wound their way across Arabia faded into memory. Yet traces remain. The rock-cut tombs of Petra still glow in the setting sun. Fragments of resin have been found in ancient temples far from Arabia, proof of journeys that crossed deserts and seas. And the very words frankincense and myrrh linger in collective memory, preserved in texts, rituals, and even in songs long after the caravans themselves vanished into the dunes. There is something quietly poetic in the thought that such fragile substances shaped entire economies. A lump of resin burned to ash in a matter of hours could command wealth enough to build cities and sustain kingdoms. It is a reminder that value is not always in permanence. Sometimes it is in the fleeting, the curl of smoke rising toward the heavens, carrying prayers, perfuming the air, and vanishing on the wind. Walking those routes today, one might see only sand and rock, the silence of the desert broken only by the wind. But if you pause long enough, it is possible to imagine the line of camels stretching to the horizon, their bells clinking softly, their shadows stretching long at dusk. You might almost smell the faint sweetness of resin on the air, a fragrance that once moved empires. And you might reflect on how something so delicate could leave such a lasting imprint on the story of the world. Long before the word amber was associated with traffic lights or shades of honey, it was the treasure of the Baltic shores, a gemstone born not from the earth's depths, but from ancient forests. Amber is, after all, fossilized tree resin, hardened by time and polished by waves, often carrying within it tiny bubbles of air or even a trapped insect frozen in golden clarity for millions of years. To the people of antiquity, it was unlike anything else, a substance that caught sunlight and seemed to hold it captive. On the storm-swept beaches of the Baltic Sea, amber washed ashore after storms, glittering against dark sand like drops of congealed fire. Local communities gathered these nuggets, polishing them into beads, amulets, and ornaments. But what began as simple decoration soon grew into something much larger. Amber became an object of fascination for cultures far beyond its northern homeland. The Greeks prized it as a mysterious stone that, when rubbed, attracted bits of straw, the very property that later gave rise to the word electricity. The Romans adored it for its beauty, wearing it in jewelry and even grinding it into powders thought to have medicinal power. Demand was so high that entire networks of trade emerged, linking the cold forests of the north with the marble palaces of the Mediterranean. These trails, collectively remembered as the Amber Road, were not single straight highways. They were shifting networks of rivers, tracks, and crossings, changing with the seasons and the shifting needs of traders. From the shores of what is now Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland, amber traveled southward, sometimes by river, sometimes on footpaths, through the dense forests of Central Europe. Traders moved it along the Vistula and Elbe rivers, then overland across valleys and mountain passes, eventually reaching the Adriatic and from there the wider Mediterranean world. The journey was long and arduous. Central Europe was no gentle landscape. Thick forests loomed, filled with wolves and bears, and rivers surged with seasonal floods. Yet these challenges also created natural corridors. Rivers served as highways, carrying boats laden with goods downstream. In winter, when waterways froze, sledges could glide across the ice, keeping the flow of amber moving even when snow blanketed the land. What is remarkable is how this trade linked worlds that otherwise had little in common. In the north, communities were small, rural, and steeped in forest life. In the south, powerful city-states and empires thrived with bustling marketplaces and monumental architecture. Yet amber bridged the gap. A Roman senator might clasp an amber seal on his ring, its warm glow connecting him invisibly to a windswept Baltic beach hundreds of miles away. A Greek artisan might carve a pendant from a piece that once clung to a pine tree long before humans walked the earth. The objects themselves often carried stories. Some amber beads have been found in Mycenaean graves dating back more than 3,000 years, lying beside gold and bronze treasures. Their presence suggests that amber was not merely decoration, but a marker of prestige and status. To be buried with amber was to display a connection to distant lands, to show that one's influence or wealth stretched far beyond the horizon. Geography, as always, shaped this movement. The Carpathian Mountains, though formidable, contained passes that could be crossed by determined traders. The great rivers of Central Europe acted as both barriers and conduits, depending on how well they could be navigated. Forest clearings and marshlands alternated with dense woodlands, creating a patchwork of difficulties and opportunities. Those who knew the land, its safe crossings, its hidden fords, became vital guides, just as important as the merchants themselves. Amber's value was also deeply tied to its appearance. Each piece was unique, ranging from pale yellow to deep honey, from cloudy to crystal clear. Some pieces trapped insect or plant matter, creating a miniature world inside. For ancient observers, this must have seemed almost magical. To hold in one's hand a fly or an ant perfectly preserved in a glowing gem was to glimpse eternity, to see life held in suspension beyond time. The Romans, fascinated by natural curiosities, collected such pieces eagerly, marveling at their strange beauty. Amber also carried associations beyond the aesthetic. In Greek mythology, the glowing stone was said to be the tears of the Heliades, the sisters of Phaethon, who wept endlessly after their brother's fiery fall from the sky. Their grief hardened into drops of amber, which fell into the river and were carried to the sea. Such stories gave the material divine aura, turning each bead into something more than just a pretty ornament. It became a fragment of myth, a piece of the god's sorrow worn around the neck or sewn into garments. The trade itself was not entirely peaceful. Controlling access to amber meant controlling wealth, and various tribes and communities along the routes profited by charging tolls or offering protection. Roman accounts mentioned legions sent northward partly to secure these valuable supplies. At times, entire military expeditions were justified by the desire to guarantee a steady flow of golden resin into imperial markets. Despite these challenges, the Amber Road endured for centuries. Its paths shifted as political borders changed, but the demand for the glowing stone remained constant. Even when Rome fell, amber continued to find its way southward, carried through medieval markets and guilds. In some ways, the road never truly disappeared. It simply adapted, reshaping itself to fit the needs of the time. The imagery of this route is strikingly different from the dusty desert trails of incense or the bustling seaports of spices. Here, the trade winds through damp forests, where light filters softly through pine branches, and the ground is carpeted with moss. Amber glowing like trapped sunlight felt like a piece of warmth, carried into places often shadowed and cold. To a Roman aristocrat or a Greek philosopher, it must have seemed as though the north itself had bottled its rarest light and sent it south as a gift. Walking these trails in imagination, one can picture the slow progress of traders along riverbanks, boats loaded with sacks of amber beads or small groups trudging through woodland paths with the golden stones tucked safely away. Each step brought them closer to markets, where the stones would be transformed into bracelets, necklaces, and charms, treasures that glowed as though a piece of the sun itself had been captured. Even today, amber remains tied to memory. Museums hold delicate carvings from the ancient world, while beaches on the Baltic still yield small nuggets after storms, just as they did thousands of years ago. The trade routes may no longer carry caravans of merchants, but the story endures in every polished bead and pendant, in every ancient grave where amber still lies, waiting quietly. The amber road reminds us of a time when sunlight could be carried in the pocket, when a piece of forest resin could travel across continents, and when the glow of a stone could connect distant worlds. It is a story not of armies or conquests, but of golden pebbles rolling gently through rivers, forests, and hands, quiet, enduring proof that beauty itself has always been worth the journey. For something so commonplace today, salt has carried an importance in human history that is difficult to overstate. We shake it casually over food, scatter it on icy roads, or see it heaped in supermarket aisles. Yet for much of history, salt was nothing less than life itself. It preserved meat through long winters, kept fish edible on sea voyages, and even shaped economies and empires. To many ancient societies, salt was white gold, a mineral so essential that entire networks of trade sprang up to move it from places of plenty to places of scarcity. These were the salt roads, paths that crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers, each grain carrying far more weight than its tiny size suggests. The most famous example lies in Rome. The very word salary has its roots in salt, from the Latin salarium, referring to payments once made to soldiers in the form of this precious substance. Whether Roman legions were ever literally handed blocks of salt is debated, but the idea itself reflects how highly it was valued. Without salt, food spoiled quickly. With it, rations could last weeks or months. It allowed armies to march farther and longer. The Via Salaria, or Salt Road, led from the salt pans of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber into the heart of Italy, carrying wagon loads of crystals that sustained both citizens and soldiers. In many ways, it was the quiet backbone of Roman might. The story of salt stretches far beyond Italy. In the soaring Alps, deposits of rock salt, hidden deep in mountains, became sources of wealth for prehistoric communities. At Hallstatt, in modern-day Austria, miners were cutting into salt veins as early as the Bronze Age. The town's name even gave rise to the term Hallstatt culture, describing a vast swath of Central European society. Miners there dug with antler picks, their bodies preserved astonishingly well by the very substance they extracted. Salt not only paid for tools, trade, and prestige, but also left us frozen snapshots of life, mummified in crystalline time. Across the Sahara, salt caravans formed one of the most striking images of desert trade. From the great mines of Tagaza and Bilma, slabs of salt were cut and loaded onto the backs of camels, each animal carrying hundreds of pounds across hundreds of miles of blistering sand. These caravans could stretch for thousands of camels, winding like an undulating ribbon across dunes under the merciless sun. The salt they carried was destined for markets in Timbuktu and beyond, exchanged for gold, slaves, and other goods. The desert, barren as it appeared, became a highway of wealth, thanks to the minerals shimmering beneath its surface. Salt routes also crisscrossed Asia. In China, salt was so central that it shaped not only trade but governance. The state controlled its production and sale, drawing taxes from it for centuries. Salt wells were drilled, brine evaporated, and cakes of salt sent along official roads to feed both armies and common households. In many dynasties, revenue from salt taxes formed a major portion of the imperial treasury. It was not just seasoning, it was strategy, enabling the funding of infrastructure, defense, and expansion. What made salt so universally vital was its ability to preserve. In an age without refrigeration, meat and fish could spoil in a matter of hours. Rubbed with salt or soaked in brine, they could last months, even through harsh winters or across long journeys. A fisherman in the North Sea could cure his catch and send it inland. A farmer could slaughter livestock before winter and keep the meat edible until spring. Salt turned perishable abundance into stability, smoothing the unpredictable rhythms of harvest and hunt. The movement of salt also encouraged cultural connections. Along the Via Salaria, traders not only moved crystals but also news, rumors, and fashions. In the Sahara, the meeting of desert nomads and city merchants fostered exchanges of languages and traditions. At alpine salt mines, artifacts from distant lands suggest that the gleaming crystals drew traders from hundreds of miles away. Salt was never just a commodity. It was a magnet pulling people together along dusty tracks and mountain passes. The sheer physicality of the trade could be staggering. In Bilma, each camel carried about 3 slabs of salt, each slab weighing around 200 pounds. Multiply that by hundreds or even thousands of camels, and you have a mobile mountain of minerals moving steadily across the sand. In Rome, wagon after wagon rolled along the Via Salaria, their wheels cutting grooves into stone roads that can still be seen today. These grooves are silent testimonies to centuries of traffic, each rut carved by necessity and repetition. It is also remarkable how salt shaped language and culture. To be worth one's salt is a phrase that echoes the ancient valuation of the mineral. In many religions, salt symbolized purity, incorruptibility, and preservation, used in rituals from Japan to Europe. The Bible refers to a covenant of salt, symbolizing a bond meant to endure. Everywhere it appeared, salt carried both practical and symbolic weight. Humor, too, has found its place in this history. Imagine the frustration of a Roman merchant discovering that his precious cargo of salt had dissolved in a sudden rainstorm, his fortune literally melting into the mud. Or picture a weary camel, unimpressed by the irony of carrying salt through the world's largest desert, trudging onward with its crystalline load. There is something inherently poetic and perhaps a little amusing in the way this everyday mineral commanded such effort. The decline of salt routes came not because salt lost importance, but because it became easier to obtain. Advances in mining, evaporation, and later refrigeration reduced the reliance on long-distance salt trade. What once required caravans stretching to the horizon could eventually be managed with factories and railways. The mineral itself never stopped being vital. Only the drama of its movement faded. Yet echoes remain. The ruins of salt caravansaries still lie in the sands of the Sahara, their trails etched faintly into the desert floor. Hallstatt continues to mine salt to this day, its history stretching back thousands of years. The Via Salaria, though now paved and modernized, still traces the same ancient line, a road built on the movement of crystals. Salt roads remind us that the greatest forces in history are not always the glamorous ones. Sometimes they're quiet, simple necessities. Grains that melt on the tongue, slabs that dissolve in water, yet which built cities, paid soldiers, and preserved empires. They show that even something as ordinary as seasoning can be extraordinary when viewed across the span of centuries. To think that a pinch of salt on a meal today has ancestors in caravan loads, trudging through the Sahara, in wagons rolling across Roman roads, and in miners' hands deep beneath the Alps is a humbling thought. It is a reminder that the simplest things often shape the grandest stories, one grain at a time. High in the shadow of the Himalayas, where clouds wrap themselves around jagged peaks and rivers roar down valleys, there once wound a series of trails so dangerous that a single misstep could mean disaster. These were the paths of the Tea-Horse Road, routes that linked China to Tibet and India, carrying with them not only bundles of tea and caravans of sturdy horses, but also centuries of exchange between mountain peoples and empires. Tea may seem ordinary to us today, a comforting drink poured casually from teapots around the world. But in the past, it was both luxury and necessity. In Tibet, where the land is high, cold, and unforgiving, tea leaves pressed into dense bricks provided warmth, nourishment, and a form of currency. The bricks could be boiled into butter tea, a thick, salty drink that gave herders and monks energy against the bitter chill of the plateau. In exchange, the Chinese provinces of Sichuan and Yunnan coveted Tibetan horses. Sturdy, sure-footed, and strong, these animals were indispensable for cavalry, and China's armies relied upon them for centuries. Thus, tea flowed upward into the mountains while horses made their way down. The road itself was no gentle stroll. Imagine a caravan inching along a cliffside path, or wider than a single mule, with a sheer drop plunging hundreds of feet into a foaming river below. Traders led pack animals loaded with tea bricks that weighed more than 100 pounds each, balancing the loads carefully so they would not topple. In some places, travelers crossed suspension bridges woven from twisted rattan or yak hair, swaying high above icy torrents. Snowstorms could sweep in without warning, turning the trail slick and deadly. Yet for centuries, people braved these dangers, driven by the knowledge that at the end of the road waited survival, wealth, or both. Geography shaped every step of the journey. The Himalayas and their surrounding ranges are among the most challenging landscapes on Earth, with passes soaring above 15,000 feet and valleys carved by rivers like the Yangtze and the Mekong. The trails climbed through bamboo forests, across misty ridges, and over bleak alpine passes where even breathing could be difficult. Caravans moved slowly, resting at staging posts where villagers offered food and shelter. It was not a single road, but a web of paths branching and rejoining, sometimes disappearing into forest, sometimes carved directly into rock faces. The people who guided these caravans developed remarkable endurance. Porters carried tea on their backs using wooden frames, some hauling loads that outweighed their own bodies. Their footsteps marked the rhythm of the road, steady, deliberate, unyielding. In villages along the way, economies flourished from the constant trickle of travelers. Inns provided warm fires, blacksmiths repaired horseshoes, and markets bustled with goods brought from far-off valleys. Each stop was a small world of exchange, a point where cultures met and mingled. The tea itself was a marvel of compression. To make transport easier, leaves were steamed and pressed into solid bricks or discs, sometimes marked with intricate stamps of dragons or floral designs. These bricks were durable, resistant to damp, and could be stacked neatly onto mule backs. In Tibet, they even became a form of money. Transactions could be measured not in coins, but in bricks of tea, a currency you could drink when times were hard. There is something wonderfully practical about that, a wallet you can boil. Horses traveled in the opposite direction, their breath steaming in the cold air as they picked their way carefully down slopes. Tibetan horses were valued for their toughness, able to thrive on rough grazing and withstand the thin air of high altitudes. To China's armies, they were priceless. It is no exaggeration to say that the strength of Chinese cavalry depended on this trade. Wars, diplomacy, and alliances all intersected with the rhythm of the Tea-Horse Road. The dangers of the journey left their mark on stories and memory. Travelers spoke of treacherous gorges where a single slip could sweep an animal and its load into a roaring river. They told of bandits lurking in forest passes, ready to relieve a caravan of its cargo. They remembered blizzards that swallowed entire groups and landslides that erased paths in an instant. Yet the road endured generation after generation because its necessity outweighed its peril. The road also served as a conduit for ideas and beliefs. Buddhism, traveling from India into China, found some of its passage along these very trails. Monks carried scriptures as carefully as merchants carried tea, and monasteries sprang up to provide refuge and spiritual guidance to those making the arduous trek. In turn, Tibetan culture left its imprint on the valleys of Yunnan and Sichuan, weaving together traditions of food, language, and ritual. At times, the road even reflected the politics of empires. Dynasties in China established offices to oversee the exchange of tea for horses, regulating prices and ensuring supplies. In some centuries, the trade was highly formalized, with quotas for how many horses could be exchanged for how much tea. At other times, when central power waned, local traders carried on the exchange independently, their caravans forming lifelines that ignored shifting politics. Walking these paths in the mind, one can imagine the sensory details. The smell of pine smoke drifting from mountain huts, the creak of leather straps as porters adjusted their loads, the sharp taste of butter tea on a cold morning, salty and sustaining, the muffled sound of hooves on snow as a line of horses wound its way up a frosted ridge. Life on the road was harsh, but it was also full of rhythm, community, and resilience. Over the centuries, the tea-horse road gradually lost its prominence. New transport routes, modern roads, and eventually railways and trucks replaced the slow caravans. The armies of China no longer depended on Tibetan horses, and tea could be shipped by other means. Yet in remote valleys, faint traces of the trail remain. Stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, rope bridges that sway in mountain winds, and villages that still remember the days when their survival depended on the endless march of tea bricks and horses. There is a kind of poetry in this exchange. A leaf grown in misty Chinese hillsides, packed tightly into a brick, carried on a mule's back through perilous passes, boiled into a steaming drink in a Tibetan monastery. A horse raised on high plateaus led carefully down rocky paths, feeding an army that guarded distant plains. Together they created a cycle of need and supply, of endurance and trust, carved into some of the most forbidding landscapes on earth. The Tea-Horse Road speaks of patience and persistence, of human determination to connect across even the harshest environments. It reminds us that geography is not just obstacle, but the stage upon which trade, culture, and survival all play out. To picture those winding trails high among the clouds is to see the quiet strength of people and animals bound together in journeys of necessity. Journeys that brick by brick and hoof by hoof shaped history. In the thin air of the mountains, the very phrase Silk Road carries with it a shimmer of romance. One imagines caravans moving slowly across endless deserts, shimmering fabrics fluttering in the wind, and bustling markets where languages collided like waves. It is perhaps the most famous trade route in history. But its reality was both richer and more complex than its name suggests. Yes, silk was at its heart, luminous, soft, and coveted, far beyond the borders of China. But the roads and trails that linked east and west carried much more than fabric. They were arteries through which flowed not just goods, but beliefs, art, technologies, and the very gossip of empires. To picture the Silk Road is to imagine a network rather than a single road. It stretched thousands of miles from the Chinese capital of Chang'an, through the deserts of Central Asia, over mountains as forbidding as the Pamir and the Tian Shan, across Iran and onward to the great cities of the Mediterranean world. But it did not exist as a straight line. Instead, it was a web of branching routes, splitting and converging, finding the safest passages through hostile landscapes. Geography dictated every step. Mountains had to be crossed at narrow passes where avalanches were a constant threat. Deserts had to be navigated from one oasis to the next, where water was as valuable as gold. The Taklamakan Desert, in particular, earned a reputation as a place that swallowed caravans whole, its dunes stretching like an ocean of sand with only the faintest traces of human passage. In these oases, entire cultures thrived. Towns like Kashgar, Samarkand, and Merv became jewels of the desert, sustained not by fertile fields, but by the constant traffic of traders. They were marketplaces where you could buy silk from China, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, spices from India, and glassware from Rome, all in the same bazaar. Caravansaries built along the routes offered shelter, food, and security. Within their thick walls, merchants from across continents gathered, their animals tethered in courtyards while deals were struck and tales were exchanged. These were not only places of commerce, but hubs of human interaction, the Wi-Fi hotspots of their age, buzzing with information. Silk itself was a marvel. For centuries, the Chinese guarded the secret of its production fiercely. According to legend, it was first discovered when a cocoon fell into the teacup of a Chinese empress, unraveling into a fine thread that could be spun into cloth. However it was discovered, the result was unlike anything the rest of the world had seen. Smooth, lustrous, and astonishingly strong, silk became a symbol of wealth and refinement. To wear it was to announce one's status. Romans adored it, though some moralists complained that the fabric was too sheer and decadent. Even so, bolts of silk continued to pour into the empire, exchanged for silver and gold. But to reduce the Silk Road to silk alone is to miss its deeper story. Along its dusty paths traveled ideas that would change the world. Buddhism spread from India into China along these routes, carried by monks who stopped at oases to translate scriptures and build monasteries. Christianity and Islam likewise found their way eastward, their texts and teachings carried in the saddlebags of travelers. Art styles blended. Persian motifs appeared in Chinese ceramics, while Indian influences could be seen in Central Asian sculpture. Musical instruments, too, moved along the road. The lute, ancestor of the modern guitar, made its way from Central Asia into Europe. Languages intermingled as easily as goods. Traders might switch tongues several times in a single transaction, speaking Greek to one partner, Persian to another, and bits of Turkish to a third. In a world without translation apps, multilingualism was survival. Scripts adapted, loan words multiplied, and the very shape of communication changed with each encounter. There were, of course, less tangible cargoes as well. Gossip traveled as fast as silk. News of wars, rumors of dynasties rising or falling, stories of strange customs or miraculous beasts all slipped from one caravan to another. A merchant might arrive in Samarkand with a bolt of silk, but he would also carry tales of a new emperor in China or a battle won on the Indian frontier. In this way, the Silk Road functioned as the world's first great rumor mill. One might say that silk was luxurious, but so were the whispers and stories that moved alongside it. The road was not without peril. Bandits lurked in passes, waiting for caravans heavy with goods. Sandstorms could blot out the sky and leave travelers disoriented. Political shifts could open or close borders overnight, rerouting entire networks of trade. Yet these risks were balanced by the rewards. A single caravan that reached its destination might bring back profits enough to make a family wealthy for generations. One often overlooked aspect of the Silk Road was the exchange of technology. Paper invented in China spread westward along these routes, eventually transforming education, bureaucracy, and literature across the Islamic world and into Europe. The technique of making gunpowder followed a similar path. In the other direction, glass-making techniques from the Mediterranean found their way east. It was a two-way street of innovation, with ideas leaping across cultural boundaries as readily as material goods. The scale of the network meant that very few people traveled its full length. Most trade was relay-based. A Chinese merchant might carry silk as far as Central Asia, sell it there, and return home with other goods. From there, another trader would take it onward. The silk that arrived in Rome or Byzantium had likely passed through dozens of hands, each adding their own mark, their own story. In this sense, the Silk Road was less about individual journeys and more about the collective motion of countless small exchanges, rippling outward like waves from a stone cast into a pond. The road also carried less welcome passengers. Diseases traveled along with merchants, most famously the plague. The Black Death that swept Europe in the 14th century traced its origins back along these trade routes, demonstrating that the Silk Road's role as a connector of worlds came with both blessings and curses. Even so, the overall story of the route is one of enrichment, of cultures deepened, economies strengthened, and horizons widened. The imagery of the Silk Road is endlessly captivating. Picture the golden dunes of the Taklamakan, broken only by the distant line of a caravan. Imagine the snow-capped peaks of the Pamir, where trails cut precariously across ridges above rushing rivers. See the oases where orchards blossomed against desert sands, a splash of green in an ocean of gold. Hear the babble of voices in a caravansary courtyard at night, lit by oil lamps where merchants sip tea and share both goods and stories. The legacy of the Silk Road lingers. Even today, its name is invoked to describe modern projects of connection as nations attempt to revive the sense of East and West bound together. Yet the real story lies not in slogans, but in the countless exchanges that once took place on its trails, in the silk robes worn in Roman villas, in the Buddhist sutras translated in Chinese monasteries, in the musical scales that leap from one culture to another. It is humbling to remember that all of this was possible because people dared to cross some of the most daunting landscapes on Earth. They trusted their camels, their maps written in memory, and the hospitality of strangers in distant lands. They followed stars across deserts, traced rivers through valleys, and trudged over mountains where the air grew thin. And in doing so, they created not just a trade route, but a world where cultures touched, blended, and transformed. The Silk Road was more than silk, more than trade, more than geography. It was the recognition that the world is larger when connected, that beauty and knowledge are not confined to one place, and that even across deserts and mountains, humans will find a way to share what they value most. To walk it in imagination is to follow not only the trail of silk, but also the trail of ideas, stories, and friendships, threads that, like the fabric itself, continue to shimmer across time. There are certain smells that can change the entire atmosphere of a room in an instant. The warm sweetness of cinnamon, the sharp bite of clove, the earthy mystery of nutmeg. Today, these spices are sprinkled into desserts, simmered into curries, or quietly waiting in kitchen cupboards. But for centuries, they were treasures so rare that fortunes rose and fell on their trade. The routes that carried them across seas became some of the most important arteries of global connection. Known collectively as the spice routes, they linked the lush islands of Southeast Asia and the bustling ports of the Indian Ocean to markets as far away as the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. The geography of spice was specific, almost stubborn. Nutmeg and cloves grew only on the tiny Banda and Maluku Islands in present-day Indonesia, places so small on a map that they look like scattered specks in the ocean. Cinnamon thrived in the forests of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, while pepper vines climbed in abundance along India's Malabar coast. These plants were rooted in particular climates, in volcanic soils, in humid air, and tropical rains. That very scarcity made them precious. To people living far from these regions, spices were exotic miracles, scents and tastes from lands they could barely imagine. What made their transport possible were the monsoon winds, the great seasonal engines of the Indian Ocean. Each year, like clockwork, the winds shifted direction. From May to September, they blew steadily from the southwest, carrying ships from Africa and Arabia toward India and beyond. Then, from November to March, they reversed, sweeping back toward the coasts of Africa. Sailors learned to trust this rhythm, timing their departures to the cycle of the winds. Without these monsoons, the spice routes would have been impossible. With them, the seas became highways, opening connections between continents long before the age of steamships. The ships themselves were marvels of adaptation. Arab dhows with their triangular lateen sails could tack across the winds with surprising agility. Chinese junks with multiple masts and compartmentalized hulls were sturdy and spacious. Indian vessels filled harbors along the Malabar coast, loaded with pepper and cardamom. Each culture brought its own designs, but all shared one essential trait: the ability to harness the breath of the monsoons. Traders did not fight the winds. They partnered with them, letting the atmosphere itself dictate the pace of commerce. Ports along the routes flourished as cosmopolitan hubs. In Calicut and Cochin on India's southwest coast, warehouses bulged with pepper waiting to be loaded. Malacca on the narrow strait connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea became a bustling crossroads where Chinese, Arab, Malay, and European merchants all rubbed shoulders. Zanzibar, with its clove plantations and African ivory, hummed with voices from across the sea. These were not backwater towns, but global meeting points where mosques stood beside temples and where the scent of spices hung in the air like a constant invitation. Spices carried value far beyond their flavor. In medieval Europe, cinnamon was considered a medicine for colds, nutmeg a safeguard against plague, and clove a remedy for toothache. Pepper was so sought after that it became known as black gold, and wealthy families measured their fortunes in pounds of it. Recipes from the Middle Ages sometimes seem almost excessive to modern eyes, calling for handfuls of expensive spices in a single dish, a flamboyant display of wealth on the dining table. In a world where salt and herbs were the everyday seasonings, the sudden explosion of clove or nutmeg was like tasting a fragment of paradise. The routes also carried cultural cargo. Islam spread across the Indian Ocean, largely through merchants who established communities wherever their ships anchored. Mosques rose in coastal towns of India and Indonesia, blending seamlessly with local traditions. Buddhism and Hinduism, too, found passage across the seas, carried not by armies but by traders who offered both goods and ideas. Even languages reflect this mingling. Swahili on the East African coast developed as a blend of Bantu with generous doses of Arabic, a living testament to the conversations of sailors and merchants. There was glamour in the trade, but danger as well. Monsoons could be generous, but storms could also turn seas deadly. Ships were lost to sudden squalls or dashed against coral reefs. Pirates haunted narrow straits, waiting to seize cargo worth more than its weight in silver. Traders carried not only spices, but risk, gambling with their lives on each voyage. Yet the potential profit was irresistible. A handful of nutmeg purchased cheaply in the Banda Islands could sell in European markets for a sum that dwarfed its original price. It is little wonder that sailors set their sails year after year, drawn back into the cycle of the winds. When Europeans eventually pushed into the Indian Ocean, they did so with the single-minded desire to control these spice flows. The Portuguese, led by Vasco da Gama, found a sea route around Africa to India at the end of the 15th century. They seized coastal forts, attempting to monopolize trade. The Dutch followed, establishing the Dutch East India Company, which brutally secured control over the Banda Islands, even going so far as to uproot and replant nutmeg trees to maintain dominance. The English, too, joined the competition, their East India Company becoming a global power in its own right. All of this was sparked in large part by the allure of spices, so small you could hold them between your fingers. There is a kind of irony in the fact that cloves and cinnamon, things now picked up casually in a supermarket, once fueled exploration, conquest, and empire. They were not mere luxuries, but drivers of global change, shifting the balance of wealth and power between nations. The spice routes demonstrate how geography, climate, and human desire together shaped history. Islands barely visible on a globe influenced decisions made in royal courts thousands of miles away. To picture the spice routes is to imagine ships waiting at anchor for the winds to turn, their sails furled, their crews watching the horizon. It is to smell the mingling aromas of pepper and nutmeg in a crowded market, the air thick with voices in half a dozen languages. It is to stand at a port where palm trees sway in the humid breeze, while bales of cinnamon are carried down a gangplank onto a creaking deck. The sensory richness of the trade was overwhelming, a kaleidoscope of scents and sounds woven together by the rhythm of the sea. Though modern cargo ships and airplanes now carry spices swiftly and cheaply, the memory of those routes lingers. The monsoons still blow steady as ever, and fishermen in dhows still set their sails to them, just as their ancestors did centuries ago. In every sprinkle of cinnamon on a pastry, in every clove pressed into a stew, there lies a faint echo of distant islands, long voyages, and patient winds. The spice routes remind us that sometimes the smallest things, a seed, a bark, a dried bud, can shape the greatest journeys, filling the world not only with flavor, but with stories carried across oceans of time. Stretching across the northern half of Africa lies the Sahara, a desert so vast that it is difficult to grasp its scale. It spans more than 3 million square miles, larger than the continental United States, an expanse of shifting dunes, stony plateaus, and scorching plains. At first glance, it seems impossible that such a place could ever serve as a highway of trade. Yet for centuries, the Sahara was precisely that. From the golden wealth of West Africa to the bustling markets of North Africa and beyond, caravans of camels traced invisible lines across its emptiness, linking Timbuktu with Cairo and villages along the Niger, with ports on the Mediterranean. These were the trans-Saharan routes, pathways carved not with stone or road markers, but with memory, endurance, and the quiet resilience of desert life. The secret to this improbable commerce was the camel. Introduced into North Africa from Arabia around the early centuries of the first millennium, camels became the indispensable vehicles of the desert. Their ability to go for days without water, to carry heavy burdens, and to plod steadily across scorching sands turned what might have been an impenetrable barrier into a bridge. Each animal could bear up to 600 pounds, often in the form of salt slabs, bundles of cloth, or sacks of grain. Strings of camels, tethered together, stretched into long, undulating processions, moving like living ships across a sea of sand. Salt was among the most important commodities carried northward, cut in great slabs from mines at places such as Tahaza and Bilma. Salt was stacked high upon camelbacks and marched across the desert. To us, it may seem curious that salt, a substance so common today, was once as precious as gold. But in hot climates where food spoiled quickly, salt preserved meat and fish, enabling societies to thrive far from coastal waters. Entire cities grew wealthy by controlling this trade. Timbuktu, for instance, once a relatively modest settlement, blossomed into a center of scholarship and commerce, precisely because it sat at the crossroads of caravans. Its markets were piled high with salt, while manuscripts and knowledge flowed alongside mineral wealth. If salt traveled north, gold traveled south. The forests and rivers of West Africa were rich in gold, especially in regions like modern-day Ghana and Mali. This gold made its way across the desert, ultimately reaching coin presses in Cairo, mints in Venice, and treasuries across the Islamic and European worlds. The great Malian ruler, Mansa Musa, became legendary for his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, when his caravan carried so much gold that its spending reportedly disrupted economies along the way. Gold glittered across the dunes, invisible under camel blankets, but powerful enough to shift the fortunes of empires. The geography of the Sahara was both challenge and guide. Though we imagine it as endless dunes, in truth it is varied. There are seas of sand where the horizon undulates like ocean waves, broken only by the silhouette of a lone caravan. There are gravel plains, windswept and flat, where pebbles crunch underfoot. There are rocky plateaus, sheer and dramatic, rising suddenly from the horizon. But wherever caravans went, one element determined survival above all else: water. Wells and oases became vital stepping stones, spaced days apart, known intimately to those who had inherited desert knowledge. To lose the way between them was to risk death. The desert was silent, but it was not forgiving. Traveling these routes was as much an act of endurance as of navigation. Caravans often moved by night when the air cooled and stars gave direction. The North Star, steady in the heavens, became a companion to every desert traveler. During the day, animals and humans alike endured blinding sun, their shadows stretching long across the sands. Dust storms could appear suddenly, swallowing the sky in walls of grit and forcing caravans to huddle in place. Yet the rhythm of footsteps and padded hooves continued year after year, drawing lines across the desert that never appeared on any map. The cities at either end of these routes flourished. Cairo, perched on the Nile and gateway to the Mediterranean, became the northern hub of trans-Saharan trade, where gold and slaves from the south mingled with spices and textiles from the east. In the south, Timbuktu and Gao thrived as centers of learning, where scholars copied manuscripts and students debated philosophy beneath the desert sun. In many ways, it was knowledge itself that became the most precious cargo of the desert. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, written in Arabic and covering subjects from medicine to astronomy, stand as proof that ideas traveled the same roads as minerals and cloth. The movement of people was just as important as the movement of goods. Tuareg nomads with their distinctive indigo veils became guides and guardians of caravans. Berber merchants led trains of camels with practiced ease, their memory of desert landmarks far surpassing any written chart. Traders from West Africa brought gold and kola nuts. Traders from the north brought textiles and horses. Together they created a circulation of cultures, a mixing of languages, and an exchange of traditions. In markets, one could hear Arabic alongside Songhai, Berber alongside Hausa. Each tongue carried its own rhythms across air thick with dust and commerce. For all its importance, life on the trans-Saharan routes was rarely easy. Heat could blister the skin, and water skins were guarded as though they were treasure chests. Camels groaned under their burdens, and drivers sometimes walked for weeks with little more than dry dates and water as sustenance. At night, under skies so clear that the Milky Way seemed to spill like a river of light, caravans rested, their animals kneeling in the sand while traders huddled close around small fires. The desert's silence was immense, broken only by the sigh of wind or the occasional bark of a distant fox. It was a world of extremes, searing heat by day, icy cold at night, and always the endless march of sand underfoot. Despite these hardships, the trans-Saharan trade endured for centuries, weaving the desert into the broader fabric of world commerce. Its decline came only when new sea routes around Africa opened in the 15th and 16th centuries, allowing ships to bypass the desert entirely. Golden goods could be moved faster and more safely by sea, and gradually the great caravans dwindled. The desert returned to silence, its roots remembered but rarely retraced. Yet traces remain in the ruins of caravansaries. Desert inns built to shelter traders and animals. One can still see walls crumbling under the sun. In Timbuktu's libraries, fragile manuscripts whisper of a time when knowledge crossed dunes like salt and gold. And in the Sahara itself, faint tracks still scar the sand, relics of caravans that once stitched continents together. The trans-Saharan routes remind us of the resilience of human ambition, the determination to connect even across landscapes that seem designed to prevent it. They show that deserts, though barren, can serve as bridges when necessity and ingenuity meet. They reveal how silence can conceal movement, how emptiness can be filled with exchange, and how shadows cast across dunes once pointed the way toward cities of learning and wealth. To imagine those caravans today is to see a line of camels stretching into the horizon, each step a quiet reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, the desire to connect has always found a way. The Romans were famous for many things: their aqueducts, their armies, their bustling cities. But perhaps nothing symbolized their empire more clearly than their roads. Stretching like stone threads across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, the Roman road system was the circulatory network of an empire that once ruled a quarter of the known world. They were built first and foremost for soldiers, but once laid, they became the channels through which trade, ideas, and everyday life flowed. To this day, you can still walk on stones placed by Roman engineers more than 2,000 years ago, a durability that puts most modern driveways to shame. And unlike your driveway, many of these roads are still holding up rather well after all this time. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," is not just poetic, but grounded in geography. At the empire's height, more than 250,000 miles of road bound its provinces to the capital. Of those, around 50,000 miles were paved with stone, carefully engineered to withstand armies marching in formation and wagons rattling endlessly. From Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the mountains of Spain to the plains of Mesopotamia, the roads traced a vast spiderweb, every thread pointing ultimately toward Rome. The construction of these roads was an achievement of both engineering and sheer determination. Roman surveyors plotted straight lines whenever possible, cutting through forests, tunneling into hillsides, and building bridges over rivers. Layers of gravel, sand, and stone were laid down to ensure durability and drainage. On top of this foundation, large paving stones were fitted tightly together, creating a surface that was smooth enough for wagons, yet tough enough to endure centuries. The crown of the road, a slight curve at the center, allowed rainwater to run off, preventing flooding. In some places, the original stones remain, their surfaces worn smooth by the tread of countless feet, hooves, and wheels. Though designed for military use, commerce quickly claimed its share of the network. Traders loaded carts with wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, grain from Egypt, and pottery from Italy. Inns and taverns sprang up along the way, offering wearied travelers a place to eat, sleep, or exchange gossip. Blacksmiths hammered out repairs for wagon wheels, and stables provided fresh horses for couriers racing across provinces with urgent messages. The roads were not just cold stone. They were alive with activity, pulsing with the daily movements of empire. At the heart of the system lay milestones, the ancient equivalent of road signs. These stone markers told travelers how far they were from Rome, and sometimes even named the emperor who had commissioned the road. It was a constant reminder that no matter where one wandered, the power of the empire extended back to its center. For merchants, these markers also provided reassurance, proof that they were on a recognized, maintained route, less likely to fall prey to bandits or get lost in wilderness. The roads transformed economies by shrinking distance. A merchant in Gaul could send wine to Rome in weeks rather than months. Grain from Sicily could feed citizens in the capital with far greater reliability. Soldiers could march swiftly to frontier garrisons, securing trade routes and protecting merchants. In short, the roads stitched together a world that might otherwise have remained fragmented. They created the sense of a single empire, a unity underpinned by stone. There was also a cultural exchange woven into the cobblestones. Along the roads moved not only goods, but actors, teachers, pilgrims, and preachers. New religions spread along these routes, including Christianity, which traveled from the eastern provinces to Rome and beyond thanks to the reliable arteries of communication. Dialects mingled, fashions spread, and ideas about art, architecture, and law traveled with the same ease as soldiers and spices. Of course, travel was not always easy. Wagons jolted over uneven stones, horses grew weary, and travelers faced the dangers of weather and banditry. Yet compared with the muddy tracks and twisting paths that existed elsewhere in the ancient world, Roman roads offered unmatched reliability. To step onto one was to know that you were part of something vast, that the way forward would be steady and purposeful. The Via Appia, perhaps the most famous of all Roman roads, stretched from Rome to Brindisi on the Adriatic coast. Known as the Queen of Roads, it became a vital link for armies heading eastward and for traders moving goods to and from the sea. Today, stretches of it remain in use, bordered by tall cypress trees and flanked by ancient tombs. Walking it is like stepping back into a world where stone was destiny, and where the sound of sandals striking pavement echoed the rhythm of empire. Even in far-flung provinces, the roads carried the same sense of permanence. In Britain, straight Roman tracks cut across hills and fields, some later adopted as medieval roads or even modern highways. In North Africa, routes connected fertile farmlands with bustling coastal cities. In the Middle East, they traversed arid landscapes, linking oases and forts. Everywhere they went, they brought the unmistakable stamp of Rome, order imposed upon geography. The durability of Roman roads is perhaps their most astonishing feature. Centuries of weather, war, and neglect have not erased them. In many cases, modern roads still follow their ancient alignments, testifying to the practicality of their surveyors. While potholes plague 21st century motorists, stones laid by Roman engineers continue to endure. It is a quiet reminder that sometimes the old ways really were built to last. Humor aside, the endurance of these roads tells us something about the Roman worldview. They were not content with temporary solutions. Each road was an assertion of permanence, a claim that Rome's presence was not fleeting, but fixed in stone. The roads embodied the empire's ambition to connect, to control, and to endure. The expression, "all roads lead to Rome," has lived on long after the empire itself faded. It reflects not just the physical reality of the network, but the symbolic truth that Rome was once the gravitational center of a vast world. Roads radiated outward like spokes from a wheel, carrying with them the promise of connection and the authority of empire. Today, the remnants of these roads invite reflection. To walk on them is to follow the footsteps of soldiers marching to battle, of traders guiding their carts, of pilgrims seeking shrines. Each stone is a witness to centuries of movement, an enduring link between past and present. The Roman roads remind us that infrastructure is not merely practical, it is cultural, shaping the way people live, trade, and imagine themselves. In the end, the Roman road system was more than engineering. It was the physical expression of unity, the stitching together of landscapes and peoples into a coherent whole. And while the empire that built them has long since vanished, the roads endure, still leading us back to the idea of Rome, a place where stone met ambition, and where every journey in some way still finds its way home. The image of the Vikings that lingers in popular imagination is often one of raiding, helmets with horns that never existed, and villages of flame along European coasts. Yet the reality was far more complex. These northern seafarers were not only warriors, but also skilled navigators, shrewd merchants, and tireless explorers. Their world was bound together not by paved roads or caravan trails, but by water. Across the North Sea and Baltic, the Vikings carved out sea lanes that carried furs, amber, silver, and slaves, linking their fjord-bound homelands with markets as distant as Byzantium and Baghdad. Geography was their stage. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are lands cut by fjords, dotted with islands, and rimmed by icy seas. Land travel was slow and difficult, hampered by forests, mountains, and bogs. But the sea, for all its storms, offered speed and reach. The Vikings became masters of these waters, treating waves not as barriers but as highways. Where others saw peril, they saw possibility. Their longships were the secret to this mastery. Sleek and shallow-keeled, they could glide swiftly over open sea, yet slip quietly into rivers and estuaries. Powered by both sail and oar, they offered flexibility unmatched by other vessels of the age. With their clinker-built hulls, overlapping planks that provided strength while keeping weight low, they were sturdy yet light enough to be carried over short stretches of land. A Viking crew could portage a ship across narrow strips between rivers, effectively stitching together waterways into a single extended network. On these vessels traveled goods that reflected the richness of the North. Furs from Arctic animals, soft and warm, were highly prized in the chill courts of Europe and the Middle East. Amber, that glowing fossilized resin from the shores of the Baltic, captivated buyers just as it had in Roman times. Slaves captured in raids or warfare were sold in markets from Dublin to Constantinople. In return, silver poured northward, much of it in the form of coins minted in the Islamic world. Hordes of Arabic dirhams found buried in Sweden testify to the astonishing reach of Viking commerce. To navigate these seas was no small feat. The North Sea is notorious for sudden storms, its waves steep and punishing. The Baltic, though calmer, froze in winter and was hemmed in by treacherous shores and narrow straits. Yet the Vikings learned to read the natural world with exquisite care. They watched the flight of seabirds, gauged the color of water, and noted the drift of seaweed. At night, they steered by the stars, including the North Star, that pointed them unwaveringly toward true north. It is even said that they used sunstones, crystals that polarize light, to locate the sun on cloudy days, though whether this was a widespread practice or later legend remains debated. The sea lanes they forged reached astonishing distances. To the west, they sailed to the British Isles, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and even the shores of North America, where evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland proves that Norse explorers set foot around the year 1000. To the east, they moved along the rivers of Russia, reaching the Black Sea and the Caspian. The so-called Varangians who traveled this way became the stuff of chronicles, serving as mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire and trading with the caliphates of the Middle East. Few networks of the early medieval world rivaled the breadth of the Viking maritime routes. Ports and settlements dotted these sea lanes, acting as nodes of exchange. Hedeby in modern Germany, Birka in Sweden, and Kaupang in Norway became bustling emporia where merchants gathered. Archaeological finds reveal glass beads from the Middle East, silks from Asia, and silver coins stamped with Arabic script. These towns were not random outposts, but organized markets, carefully situated at crossroads of sea and land routes. Life there was lively and multicultural, a far cry from the stereotype of Vikings as isolated raiders. The northern environment itself gave the trade its character. In summer, long days of light made voyages possible, almost around the clock, the midnight sun glowing above calm waters. In winter, darkness descended early, ice crept across harbors, and travel slowed to a halt. Against this backdrop, the northern lights sometimes danced in the sky, flickering green and red across the horizon. For sailors far from land, such sights must have been both awe-inspiring and unsettling, reminders that nature itself was as mysterious a force as any god. Trade and raiding often overlapped. A fleet might one year attack a coastal monastery, and the next return as merchants bearing goods. Silver acquired through plunder might be melted down into ingots used for trade. The boundary between piracy and commerce was blurred, shaped more by opportunity than by ideology. Yet over time, as Viking societies became more settled and kingdoms grew, the trading side gained prominence. Markets thrived, alliances deepened, and Scandinavian rulers realized that steady commerce could be as profitable as sudden raids. The Viking sea lanes also carried culture. Norse sagas tell of voyages and exploits, stories that preserved history and myth in equal measure. Along with goods, travelers brought songs, stories, and styles. Decorative patterns from the north appear in Irish metalwork. Eastern influences can be traced in Scandinavian jewelry. Languages mingled, leaving loan words still visible in modern English. Words like knife, sky, and window owe their origins to Norse sailors who once crossed the North Sea. There was, too, an element of humor in the sheer stubbornness of these sailors. Imagine setting off from a fjord in Norway, knowing that your destination lay across a gray, storm-prone sea, with no compass, no charts, and only the sky for guidance. It is a bit like setting out on a road trip without a map and trusting entirely in cloud shapes. Yet somehow, voyage after voyage, they reached their destinations. Perhaps luck played its part, but skill, memory, and patience were the true anchors of their success. The decline of Viking dominance on the sea routes came gradually. By the 11th century, stronger kingdoms in Europe improved their own navies, while Scandinavia itself became more centralized, its rulers turning toward land-based power. Christianity spread through the north, altering cultural patterns and reducing the appeal of long-distance raiding. But the routes remained, and the skills of navigation and shipbuilding continued to influence generations. Even today, the legacy of those sea lanes is visible. Many European towns trace their origins to Viking trading posts. The sagas preserve memories of voyages across wild seas, and the very idea of northern seafaring, hardy sailors in long, sleek vessels braving storms and stars, remains etched into cultural memory. To stand on a northern coast now, with the waves crashing and gulls wheeling overhead, is to sense something of what those sailors once knew, that the sea is both peril and promise, a shifting mirror that can conceal treasure or disaster. The Vikings trusted it, challenged it, and learned to ride its moods. Their sea lanes remind us that geography is not only about land, but also about water, and that sometimes the greatest highways of history lie not in stone or sand, but in the restless expanse of the ocean. Stretching from the edges of Eastern Europe across Central Asia and into China lies one of the most remarkable landscapes on Earth, the Eurasian steppe. It is a vast ribbon of grassland, thousands of miles wide, treeless for long stretches, and seemingly endless to the horizon. To outsiders, it could appear monotonous, a sea of grass and sky, broken only by rivers, low hills, and the occasional grove. But to those who knew it well, it was a land of opportunity, a place where the horse could be harnessed and mobility turned into power. These sweeping plains became corridors of movement, highways without paving stones, where entire peoples swept across continents. Long before caravans trudged along the Silk Road, the steppe was already alive with motion. The Scythians, among the earliest great nomadic powers, roamed the grasslands north of the Black Sea more than 2,000 years ago. They were famed for their horse-riding skills, their archery, and their distinctive art. Greek chroniclers described them with both awe and fear, painting them as fierce warriors who seemed almost inseparable from their mounts. Archaeological finds of Scythian tombs reveal golden ornaments, intricate weaponry, and textiles that hint at connections stretching far beyond their homelands. These were not isolated raiders, but participants in wide networks of exchange. The geography of the steppe made such movement possible. With few natural barriers, horses could gallop for days across grasslands, covering distances that would have taken settled farmers weeks to traverse. Rivers ran from north to south, offering both water and pathways into forested zones and farmlands. To the west lay Europe, to the east China, and in between the rolling grasslands provided a stage for centuries of interaction, migration, and trade. The steppe was not empty, but alive, its openness a kind of invitation for mobility. The Huns, arriving centuries later, brought terror to the gates of the Roman Empire. Emerging from Central Asia in the 4th century, they swept westward, driving other peoples before them and reshaping the map of Europe. Their horsemen were renowned for speed and ferocity, striking suddenly and vanishing just as quickly. To Rome, the Huns seemed like a storm from nowhere. But in truth, they were the latest wave in a long history of nomadic peoples harnessing the mobility of the steppe. Alongside their military impact, they also carried with them the flow of goods and practices, trading when it suited them, raiding when it did not. The Mongols, however, transformed steppe mobility into something unprecedented. Under Genghis Khan in the 13th century, they forged the largest contiguous land empire in history. Their mounted warriors could cover incredible distances in astonishingly short times, moving faster than any army of their age. But the Mongol achievement was not only military. They reshaped trade across Eurasia, opening routes, protecting caravans, and knitting together lands as distant as China, Persia, and Russia. The so-called Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, ensured that merchants could travel with a security unknown in earlier centuries. Caravans laden with silk, paper, porcelain, and spices moved under the watch of mounted patrols. Even European travelers like the Venetian Marco Polo ventured eastward with relative safety thanks to the empire's oversight. Nomadic empires understood the value of controlling exchange. They often taxed caravans and levied tribute or established relay stations where horses could be swapped, allowing messages and goods to move at remarkable speed. The Mongols, for instance, created an elaborate postal system known as the Yam, with way stations dotting their territory. Couriers could gallop from station to station, changing horses and covering up to 200 miles in a single day. In many ways, it was the ancient world's version of express delivery, albeit without tracking numbers. Trade along the steppe corridors included not only luxury goods, but also essentials. Livestock, hides, grains, and textiles moved between nomads and settled peoples. Nomads supplied horses, which were in constant demand by armies from China to Byzantium. In return, they acquired metal goods, grain, wine, and manufactured products. This exchange was not incidental, but fundamental, creating symbiotic relationships between grassland riders and urban centers. Even when tensions flared, the mutual need for goods ensured that contact rarely ceased entirely. The culture of the steppe itself reflected this constant motion. Tents made of felt and wood, easily dismantled and carried, allowed families to move with their herds. Diet centered on dairy, meat, and fermented mare's milk, a drink with a kick that might surprise an unsuspecting traveler. Clothing was designed for horseback life, practical and durable, suited to long hours in the saddle. Yet artistic expression flourished too. Intricate metalwork adorned bridles and weapons, and textiles bore colorful patterns influenced by neighbors both east and west. Life on the steppe was not without its hardships. Winters could be brutally cold, with winds howling across open plains and snow covering grazing land. Summers brought searing heat and sudden storms. For nomads, survival meant adaptability, moving herds to better pastures, finding water, and maintaining constant vigilance. But these very challenges produced a culture that valued mobility above all, a culture that could harness geography to its advantage in ways that settled farmers could not. Humor can be found in the image of a Mongol envoy outriding a message sent centuries later by horse-drawn coach in Europe. While kings and castles waited weeks for letters to crawl across muddy roads, Mongol messengers could gallop across half a continent with startling efficiency. If social media had existed in the 13th century, the Mongols would have been the first to master it, delivering updates at lightning speed compared to their contemporaries. The influence of the steppe corridors stretched far beyond the nomads themselves. European armor and tactics shifted in response to encounters with mounted archers. Chinese walls grew higher and stronger to repel steppe incursions. Islamic states found themselves alternately trading with and resisting waves of nomadic pressure. Even the Renaissance owed a quiet debt to these exchanges. Paper and printing techniques, carried along Mongol guarded routes, helped lay the groundwork for Europe's transformation. When nomadic empires declined, the corridors did not disappear. The grasslands remained, waiting for the next wave of riders, traders, or conquerors. Over time, as maritime routes gained prominence, the dominance of the steppe diminished. Yet its legacy lingered in the cultural blend it had fostered, in the technologies it had spread, and in the very idea that vast open spaces could serve as bridges rather than barriers. To imagine the steppe today is to picture a horizon that never seems to end, the sky immense, and the land stretching flat and green. It is to hear the sound of hooves drumming across grass, of riders calling to one another, of wind rushing endlessly across plains. The steppe corridors remind us that history is not only written in cities and walled markets, but also in the open spaces where mobility itself became the greatest asset. The Scythians, the Huns, and above all the Mongols showed how geography could be transformed into power, how a sea of grass could carry not just armies, but also the flow of goods, ideas, and connections that shaped the old world. These corridors, invisible on modern maps, were once among the most dynamic routes of exchange on the planet. They demonstrate that roads do not always need paving stones, and that sometimes the best highways are those carved by wind, hooves, and memory across the boundless sweep of grass. High in the Andes, where snow gleams on distant peaks and valleys plunge in dizzying drops, the Incas built one of the most extraordinary transportation networks in history. Without wheels, without iron, and without horses or oxen, they managed to stitch together an empire that stretched for more than 2,000 miles along the spine of South America. Their roads wound across mountains, clung to cliffsides, and spanned rivers on bridges woven entirely from the grass. Even today, centuries after the fall of their empire, traces of these routes remain, silent proof of human determination, in one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. The Andes themselves were both obstacle and opportunity. Rising like a jagged backbone from Colombia through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and into Chile and Argentina, they are the second highest mountain range in the world, rivaled only by the Himalayas. Here, geography dictated everything. Valleys produced crops such as maize and potatoes, while highlands offered grazing land for llamas and alpacas. But to connect these scattered regions into a single political and economic system required more than trails. It required vision and a remarkable feat of engineering. The Inca road network, known as the Capac Ñan, was the answer. Stretching over 25,000 miles, it was not a single road, but a vast web of highways and byways, linking coastal deserts to mountain passes, fertile valleys to remote villages. Built with stone, paving in many places, and carved directly into rock in others, these roads were designed to endure. They traversed altitudes where the air thins and breathing becomes labored, yet they remain steady paths under the feet of runners, herders, and soldiers. The fact that sections are still walkable today, more than 500 years after their construction, is testament to their resilience. Crossing the Andes often meant confronting natural barriers that seemed insurmountable. Rivers cut, deep gorges and sheer cliffs dropped hundreds of feet. Here, the Incas revealed their ingenuity. They created suspension bridges woven entirely from grass, specifically ichu, a tough Andean grass that was twisted into cables as thick as a man's arm. Communities gathered each year to renew these bridges, braiding strands into ropes and lashing them together until they stretched across canyons in a swaying, resilient span. Crossing such a bridge was a test of nerve. Each step set the structure swaying, the river roaring below, but they held. Spanish chroniclers who first encountered them in the 16th century marveled at the skill and daring of those who maintained and used them. For transport, the Incas relied on llamas, the true cargo trucks of the Andes. Though smaller than horses and unable to carry heavy weights, usually no more than 70 or 80 pounds, llamas were perfectly adapted to mountain life. Their padded feet gripped rocky trails, their thick coats protected them from cold nights, and their ability to survive on sparse grazing made them invaluable. Caravans of llamas, each loaded with bundles of food, cloth, or tools, became a common sight along Inca roads. Patient and hardy, they carried the empire's lifeblood one slow step at a time. But llamas were not the only movers on these highways. The Incas developed an extraordinary relay system of runners known as chasqui. Positioned at intervals along the roads, these messengers sprinted with quipus, knotted cords used for record-keeping, and oral messages. By handing off their burdens to the next runner, they ensured that information could travel at astonishing speeds. Some scholars estimate that a message could be carried from Cusco to Quito, a distance of more than 1,000 miles, in just a matter of days. It was the Inca version of express delivery, powered not by wheels or engines, but by human lungs and legs. The roads also supported the movement of armies. The Inca Empire, after all, was built not only on diplomacy, but also on conquest. Soldiers marched along these routes to secure distant provinces, while supplies followed in their wake. Fortresses and storage depots lined the roads, ensuring that troops never lacked food or weapons. The roads gave the Incas the ability to project power across an empire that encompassed deserts, mountains, and jungles, creating a cohesion that would have been impossible without them. In daily life, the roads tied together diverse landscapes and cultures. Farmers in high valleys could send potatoes and quinoa to lower altitudes, where they were exchanged for maize or tropical fruits. Artisans in one region might trade woven textiles for ceramic jars from another. Pilgrims used the roads to reach sacred sites, their journeys echoing with chants and rituals. The network was not merely functional, it was spiritual, embedding the empire's geography into a sacred landscape. The Spanish conquest in the 16th century brought dramatic changes, but even the conquistadors recognized the brilliance of the Inca system. They used the roads themselves to march their armies and move supplies, often relying on local knowledge to navigate the vast distances. Many colonial routes were built directly on top of Inca foundations, and modern roads in Peru and Bolivia still trace their ancient lines. The resilience of these paths, cut and laid without iron tools, continues to astonish engineers today. There is a certain humor in imagining the contrast between the Roman chariot clattering along paved highways in Europe and the Inca llama caravan plodding patiently through the Andes. One was noisy and fast, the other quiet and slow. Yet both achieved the same essential goal: the uniting of far-flung lands under a single political vision. And in terms of durability, the Incas might claim victory. For while no llama-drawn wagons remain, the grass bridges and stone steps of their network endure in spirit and in some cases in practice. The survival of this legacy can still be seen in Peru, where the Quesuachaca Bridge, a woven grass suspension bridge, is rebuilt each year by local communities using the same techniques as their ancestors. The event is as much a celebration as a practical necessity, drawing crowds who marvel at the resilience of tradition. Watching villagers braid and haul massive ropes into place is to witness continuity stretching back centuries, a thread of memory as tangible as the bridge itself. The Inca roads remind us that geography need not be an obstacle, but can be transformed into opportunity through ingenuity and cooperation. The Andes might appear forbidding, with their dizzying altitudes and sheer cliffs, but the Incas made them navigable. They turned stone and grass into tools of connection, linking valleys and mountainsides into an empire that thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth. To picture these roads today is to imagine narrow paths hugging mountainsides, the silhouettes of llamas against a backdrop of snow-capped peaks, and the steady rhythm of footsteps echoing across stone. It is to hear the flutter of woven ropes in the wind as a suspension bridge sways above a gorge. It is to see runners darting along trails carrying messages with breathless speed. Above all, it is to recognize how an empire was held together not by wheels and wagons, but by the strength of legs, the patience of llamas, and the creativity of a people who refused to let geography stand in their way. The Inca network remains one of history's great marvels, proof that connection is possible even in the most unlikely places. It speaks of endurance, of adaptation, and of the quiet power of collective effort. Long after the empire itself crumbled, the stones and ropes they left behind continue to whisper of a world where mountains were not barriers, but bridges. In the Middle Ages, long before passports, package tours, or guidebooks, there was already a well-worn tradition of travel across Europe and the Near East. These were the pilgrim paths, routes taken not for trade or conquest, but for faith. From the rolling hills of northern Spain to the cobbled streets of Canterbury, from the rugged Pyrenees to the holy city of Jerusalem, millions of footsteps pressed into soil and stone in search of spiritual reward. Yet these routes were never just about prayer. They also carried livelihoods, shaped towns, and transformed landscapes into networks of meaning and memory. One of the most famous was the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James. It led across Spain to the shrine of the Apostle in Santiago de Compostela, where his remains were said to rest. Pilgrims came from across Europe, threading their way over the Pyrenees, through vineyards, across plains, and into medieval cities, where the scallop shell, symbol of the pilgrim, became a common sight. The geography of the route shaped the experience. Steep climbs tested devotion, wide plateaus offered long horizons, and rivers forced careful crossings. For weary travelers, the sight of the cathedral towers rising above Santiago's rooftops was more than architecture. It was the promise of arrival, of prayers answered, and perhaps of sore feet finally resting. In England, Canterbury became a focal point for pilgrims after the martyrdom of Thomas Becket in the 12th century. His shrine in Canterbury Cathedral attracted crowds who came to honor the Archbishop slain in his own church. The journey to Canterbury became so well known that it inspired Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, in which a collection of travelers share stories along the way. Pilgrimage, after all, was not just about reaching the destination. It was also about the road itself, the conversations, the encounters, the hospitality, and the unexpected dramas that unfolded mile by mile. Farther afield, Jerusalem drew pilgrims from across Christendom. To walk where Christ was believed to have lived, died, and risen was the ultimate journey of devotion. The routes to Jerusalem were long and perilous, involving sea voyages across the Mediterranean or overland treks through unfamiliar and often hostile lands. Yet, despite risks of bandits, disease, or political conflict, pilgrims pressed on. Their determination was fueled by the conviction that reaching the holy city carried spiritual merit beyond measure. The geography of these pilgrim paths is as varied as the stories that accompanied them. Mountains had to be crossed, often with monasteries built at strategic points to offer refuge. Coastal towns flourished as departure points for ships bound for the Holy Land. Bridges were constructed specifically for pilgrims, spanning rivers that otherwise would have halted their progress. Even forests and moorlands became part of the sacred landscape, marked by crosses or shrines where travelers paused to pray. The land itself became imbued with meaning, each bend in the road a step closer to holiness. Yet pilgrimage was never a purely spiritual enterprise. Along the routes, entire economies flourished. Inns, taverns, and hostels sprang up to house the faithful. Blacksmiths shod the feet of travelers' horses or mules. Bakers filled bellies with bread, and local markets sold relics, some genuine, many not, to eager visitors. Towns along the paths grew wealthy from the steady trickle, and sometimes flood of pilgrims. Local artisans carved scallop shells or badges that identified a traveler's destination, souvenirs that also served as proof of the journey. There was even a touch of humor in this trade. Some relics became notoriously questionable. A church might claim to hold the finger bone of a saint, only for another church across the continent to display the same finger. Medieval pilgrims must have raised eyebrows at times, but the devotion itself mattered more than the authenticity of every object. The roads were alive with both faith and enterprise, each feeding the other in a curious symbiosis. The experience of pilgrimage was both communal and deeply personal. Travelers moved in groups for safety, singing hymns, reciting prayers, and sharing stories by campfire. Yet the act of walking day after day through rain and dust also invited private reflection. Each blister, each weary step became a small offering of devotion. For some, the journey was penance for sins. For others, it was a vow fulfilled after surviving illness or hardship. The landscape became a mirror of the soul, its mountains representing struggles, its rivers obstacles, its shrines moments of renewal. Pilgrims often carried tokens of their journeys home, tangible reminders of the miles they had walked. A shell from Santiago, a badge from Canterbury, or a palm frond from Jerusalem marked the traveler as someone who had braved the road. These souvenirs were badges of honor, but also connections to a wider world. A villager returning from pilgrimage brought back not only proof of devotion, but also stories of distant lands, of new foods, customs, and ideas. In this way, pilgrimage served as a form of cultural exchange as well as spiritual practice. The routes also had profound political and cultural significance. Monarchs supported pilgrimages to reinforce religious unity, while the church established networks of hospices and monasteries that strengthened its presence in remote areas. Pilgrims returning home sometimes brought with them architectural inspiration, helping to spread styles of church construction across Europe. Even music and literature were shaped by these journeys, as hymns, tales, and chants flowed along the same paths as travelers. To walk a pilgrim path today is to step into layers of history. Modern hikers on the Camino de Santiago follow routes still lined with medieval bridges and wayside crosses. Canterbury Cathedral continues to welcome visitors who stand where Becket's shrine once gleamed with jewels. In Jerusalem, the Via Dolorosa echoes with centuries of footsteps retracing the stations of the cross. These paths remain alive not only as tourist routes, but as living traditions of movement, reflection, and connection. There is something timeless about the rhythm of pilgrimage. It is slower than trade, quieter than conquest, and more personal than politics. It is a journey where the act of walking is as important as the destination, where geography becomes a partner in devotion. The mountains challenge endurance, the seas demand courage, and the long roads invite patience. Yet through these difficulties, pilgrims found meaning, each step an act of faith that stitched together landscapes and lives. The medieval pilgrim paths remind us that roads are not always about material exchange. Sometimes they're about carrying hope, penitence, and longing across miles of earth and water. They show how devotion reshaped geography, leaving behind towns, bridges, and shrines that still stand centuries later. And they reveal that even in an age of hardship and uncertainty, people were willing to set aside months, even years, to follow a road that promised something greater than themselves. To imagine these paths is to see figures walking with staffs and satchels, to hear the sound of bells ringing from distant cathedrals, and to feel the pull of a horizon, both physical and spiritual. The pilgrim routes were never only about the places they led to. They were about the transformation that happened along the way, journeys of the body that became journeys of the soul. When most people hear the word Silk Road, their minds leap to camels plodding across Asian deserts. But there was another Silk Road, one far less remembered. It did not wind over mountains or through oases, but instead unfurled across the waves of the Indian Ocean. This maritime version carried silk, porcelain, and tea not by caravan but by sail, linking China with Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and even the coral coasts of East Africa. It was a world of harbors rather than inns, of monsoon winds rather than desert stars, and of bustling ports where cultures collided in salt air and sun. The geography of the Indian Ocean made this possible. Its coastline is jagged and inviting, filled with bays, inlets, and natural harbors. Coral reefs guarded islands like jewels, and river mouths opened into fertile hinterlands that sustained city after city. Add to this the rhythm of the monsoon, the great seasonal winds that blew one way for half the year and the opposite way for the other, and you had a system of natural currents and air flows that became the very engine of trade. Mariners simply had to wait for the right season, hoist their sails, and let the winds carry them to distant shores. Chinese fleets made some of the most spectacular journeys along these waters. During the early 15th century, the Ming Dynasty launched vast expeditions under the command of Admiral Zheng He. His ships, known as treasure junks, were said to be enormous, some large enough to dwarf the caravels of Europe. Sailing from ports like Nanjing and Guangzhou, they carried silk, porcelain, and lacquer, and returned with exotic goods such as ivory, spices, and even giraffes from East Africa. These voyages reached as far as Zanzibar and Malindi, leaving behind impressions of China's grandeur. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Indian Ocean might become the center of a vast Chinese maritime sphere. The ports that dotted these routes were among the most cosmopolitan places of their age. Take Malacca. Perched on the narrow strait that links the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, it became a hub where Chinese, Indian, Arab, Malay, and later European traders all converged. The air would have been thick with the scent of cloves and cinnamon, the cries of hawkers in multiple languages, and the creak of ships unloading cargoes. Calicut, on India's Malabar coast, played a similar role, its markets renowned for pepper and cardamom. Farther west, Zanzibar gleamed with coral stone houses, its streets filled with traders from Arabia and Africa, its economy driven by cloves, ivory, and gold. Each of these ports was shaped by geography as much as by commerce. Malacca thrived because it sat at a choke point, a narrow passage that funneled trade between two oceans. Calicut prospered because of fertile hinterlands and its position along the monsoon pathways. Zanzibar grew rich from its coral reefs, which provided safe anchorages, and from its location halfway between Asia and Africa. These places were not accidents. They were the natural nodes where sea and land met, where sailors could rest, resupply, and exchange not only goods, but also stories, religions, and technologies. What traveled along the maritime Silk Road was astonishing in its variety. From China came silk, porcelain, and paper. From India came spices, cotton textiles, and precious stones. From Arabia came incense and horses. From East Africa came ivory, timber, and gold. And from every stop along the way came ideas. Islam spread across Southeast Asia on the sails of merchant dhows, taking root in places like Java and Sumatra. Buddhism and Hinduism also moved along these waters centuries earlier, leaving behind temples and sculptures that still stand. Even languages blended, with Swahili on the East African coasts absorbing Arabic words and Malay serving as a lingua franca in Southeast Asia. Sailing these waters was not without risk. Coral reefs could shred hulls in an instant. Sudden storms could overturn ships, scattering cargo into the sea. Pirates lurked in narrow straits, eager to pounce on laden vessels. Yet compared to the desert routes, the maritime paths could carry larger volumes of goods more swiftly and cheaply. A single ship could transport the equivalent of hundreds of camel loads. For that reason, once seafaring was mastered, it gradually eclipsed the overland caravans. The human side of this network was as fascinating as the goods themselves. Picture a market in Malacca where a Chinese trader haggles with a Gujarati merchant while an Arab navigator explains the timing of the next monsoon to a group of newcomers. Nearby, an African sailor sells ivory brought from the interior while Malay fishermen unload fresh catch. Each person carried with them not only cargo, but a piece of their culture, a song, a story, a recipe, a prayer. The Maritime Silk Road was not just commerce. It was conversation written on waves. Admiral Zheng He's voyages are often remembered as the high point of this system. But they were part of a much older pattern. Long before his fleets, Arab dhows and Indian ships had already been crisscrossing the ocean, guided by stars and currents. The Chinese expeditions merely amplified a network that was centuries in the making. When the Ming emperors later turned inward, dismantling the fleets, the routes did not disappear. They continued under the sails of others, carrying on the rhythm of the monsoon as they always had. For Europeans, stumbling into this world was something of a revelation. When Portuguese ships rounded Africa and entered the Indian Ocean, in the late 15th century, they found bustling trade already in full swing. Far from discovering new worlds, they were joining one that was centuries old. The wealth they saw, pepper piled high in Calicut, porcelain gleaming in Chinese markets, gold moving through Zanzibar, ignited their ambition to seize control. The Portuguese, followed by the Dutch and the English, attempted to dominate the sea lanes, often with violence. Yet even they could not erase the deep traditions of the Maritime Silk Road, which had already bound Asia and Africa together long before their arrival. To imagine this world is to see sails rising against the horizon, patched and weathered, billowing in winds that had carried countless ships before. It is to hear the slap of waves against wooden hulls, the calls of sailors in languages that overlapped and intertwined, and the bells of harbor towns ringing out across the water. It is to picture coral reefs glowing beneath turquoise seas, island harbors offering safety after weeks at sea, and the constant knowledge that the very winds which carried you onward would in time carry you home. Today, remnants of this forgotten road linger in architecture, language, and memory. The carved doors of Zanzibar, with their intricate floral designs, echo influences from India and Arabia. The mosques of Java tell of merchants who once prayed between voyages. The very cuisines of these regions, blending spices, rice, and seafood, are the edible legacy of centuries of exchange. The Maritime Silk Road may be overshadowed in textbooks by its overland counterpart, but its impact was no less profound. It connected continents not with dusty trails, but with rolling waves, with choral coasts and tidal rhythms. It was shaped not by camels, but by sails, not by oases, but by harbors. It shows that the sea, like the desert, can be a bridge rather than a barrier. To drift back into that world is to realize that history is not only written in stone roads and caravan trails, but also in tides and winds. The forgotten maritime Silk Road was a liquid highway, a shifting but dependable system that carried wealth and wonder across half the globe. It whispers still in the rhythm of the monsoon, in the bustle of modern ports, and in the memory of fleets that once set out from China and returned with tales of distant shores where the ocean met the horizon. In the chill waters of the Baltic and the North Sea, where winters locked harbors in ice and storms could rise without warning, a remarkable network of trade once flourished. It was not an empire in the traditional sense, with armies marching under banners, but an alliance of merchants and towns bound together by commerce and necessity. This was the Hanseatic League, a northern web of ports and markets that dominated trade across the region for centuries. Its reach extended from the forests of Russia to the fishing grounds of Iceland, from the timber yards of Scandinavia to the bustling streets of London and Bruges. The geography of Northern Europe shaped this story from the start. The Baltic and the North Sea were both obstacle and opportunity. Their waters froze in winter, their coasts were lined with shoals and rocky outcrops, and storms could smash ships into splinters. Yet they also connected countless rivers and hinterlands, turning remote forests and fishing villages into suppliers for the wider world. Timber, tar, pitch, and furs flowed from the north and east. Salted fish from the cold seas fed populations farther south, and manufactured goods such as cloth and beer traveled in the opposite direction. The seas, harsh as they were, became the arteries of wealth. At the heart of this system lay towns that joined forces to protect their interests. Lübeck, often called the Queen of the Hansa, became a central hub. Its warehouses brimmed with goods, its shipyards rang with hammers, and its guilds wielded influence that rivaled that of princes. From there, the League's influence spread outward. Hamburg, Bremen, and Cologne in Germany, Gdansk and Riga along the Baltic, Bergen in Norway, Bruges in Flanders, and many others. Together, these towns formed a network where trade could flow with a sense of security, backed by mutual agreements, and when necessary, a willingness to defend their rights with armed convoys. What made the Hanseatic League distinctive was its collective approach. Rather than a single king commanding loyalty, it was an association of merchants and towns cooperating for mutual benefit. They standardized weights and measures, negotiated treaties with rulers, and maintained privileges in foreign ports. If a monarch imposed unfair taxes or threatened their ships, the League could retaliate by closing its markets, cutting off a vital stream of income. Few kings wished to anger an alliance that controlled so much of Northern Europe's trade. The goods themselves tell the story of this northern web. Timber was indispensable in an age of wooden ships and buildings. Vast forests of Scandinavia and the Baltic provided planks, masts, and pitch for waterproofing. Furs, soft and warm, traveled from Russia and Finland, coveted by nobles across Europe who wrapped themselves in marten and sable. Fish, especially herring from the Baltic and cod from the North Atlantic, became staples of medieval diets, particularly during religious fasting when meat was forbidden. Barrels of salted fish left northern ports by the thousands, feeding cities far to the south. Meanwhile, manufactured items made the return journey: fine cloth from Flanders, wine from the Rhineland, and even luxury goods acquired through long-distance trade farther afield. Harbors of the League were crowded, noisy places. Ships with tall masts jostled for space along wooden piers, their sails drying in the wind after long voyages. Cranes lifted barrels from holes while dock workers shouted and carts creaked under heavy loads. In winter, ice sometimes trapped ships in place, forcing merchants to wait months before the seas thawed. Yet this seasonal rhythm was part of life, shaping both commerce and culture. Festivals often marked the reopening of navigation in spring, a reminder that the very climate governed trade as surely as politics did. Despite the cold, these towns were vibrant centers of exchange. In Bruges, merchants from across Europe met in counting houses and taverns, their conversations conducted in a jumble of languages. In Bergen, the German merchants of the Hansa established their own quarter, complete with warehouses and living quarters where they stored dried fish bound for markets across the continent. Riga and Tallinn prospered as gateways between the Baltic and the Russian interior, their streets lined with warehouses that smelled of tar, hides, and beer. Each port was both local and international, grounded in its own geography, yet tied to a much larger world. The League's influence extended beyond commerce into politics. It negotiated directly with monarchs, secured trade privileges, and sometimes even waged war. Its armed fleets, though composed of merchant ships, could enforce blockades and protect convoys from pirates. In many ways, it acted like a state without a crown, a confederation held together by shared interest rather than dynastic bloodlines. Its power lay not in castles but in contracts, not in fields but in harbors. Daily life for a Hanseatic merchant was a blend of risk and opportunity. Sailing across icy seas could be perilous. Pirates prowled the coasts, storms loomed suddenly, and navigation relied on little more than stars, compasses, and experience. Yet the rewards were immense. A successful voyage might bring enough profit to secure a family's wealth for generations. The constant movement of goods also meant constant movement of ideas. Alongside barrels of fish and stacks of timber came songs, stories, and styles. The League helped weave a shared culture across Northern Europe, one shaped by the rhythm of the sea. The humor of history lies in how everyday goods once caused such drama. Imagine herring, those small silvery fish, driving the growth of towns, the negotiation of treaties, and even the outbreak of wars. It may sound improbable, but in an age when diets and economies relied heavily on preserved fish, these unassuming creatures were a treasure. One might say the Hanseatic League was built on barrels as much as on bricks. Over time, however, challenges mounted. New powers rose. Monarchs asserted greater control over their ports, and the rise of Atlantic trade after the discovery of the Americas shifted attention westward. The League, once dominant, gradually lost influence. By the 17th century, its power had waned, though some towns remained prosperous on their own. Yet its legacy endured in the cities it shaped, the traditions it fostered, and the very idea that cooperation could give small towns the strength to rival kingdoms. Walking today through cities like Lübeck, Tallinn, or Gdansk, one still sees the red brick warehouses and gabled facades that were hallmarks of the Hanseatic age. Narrow streets open into market squares where merchants once haggled, and harbors still echo with the cries of gulls over water that once carried fleets of cargo. The northern web has faded, but its imprint is everywhere, in architecture, in legal traditions, and even in the cultural memory of Northern Europe. The Hanseatic League's story reminds us that power is not always about armies or empires. Sometimes it lies in networks, in harbors linked by ships, in towns united by shared interest, in goods that seem humble but prove indispensable. The cold seas of the Baltic and the North Sea may have been unforgiving, but they became the medium through which fish, furs, and timber transformed the fortunes of towns. In those crowded harbors under skies streaked with seabirds and sometimes lit by the northern lights, a web of trade was spun that connected distant shores into a single, thriving world. The Great Wall of China winds across deserts, mountains, and valleys like a stone ribbon stitched into the landscape. For most people, it is remembered as a defensive barrier, a mighty structure meant to keep invaders out. That image is true, but it is only part of the story. The wall was never just a line of defense. It was also a boundary of movement, a filter rather than an absolute block. It shaped the way goods, people, and ideas crossed between the settled agricultural heartlands of China and the vast grasslands of the north. In many ways, it was as much a border of trade routes as it was a bulwark against raids. Geography dictated its path. The wall follows ridgelines and escarpments, cuts across deserts, and hugs the edges of valleys. Its builders chose lines that maximized visibility and control. To the north lay the Eurasian steppe, home, two nomadic peoples whose horses and mobility made them both formidable raiders and indispensable trading partners. To the south stretched fertile plains dotted with villages and towns that produced silk, ceramics, and grain. Between the two worlds, the wall became a hinge, a place where the north and south met, not always peacefully, but often productively. Passes through the mountains became crucial points of contact. The Gansu Corridor, for example, narrowed the movement of caravans along the Silk Road into a strip of land bound by desert and mountains, funneling them past watchtowers and gates. Every caravan that passed through could be monitored, taxed, or restricted, depending on the politics of the time. Instead of sealing the frontier, the wall channeled it, directing flows like a dam that doesn't stop water but controls its release. Trade along these borders was both official and unofficial. At sanctioned markets, nomads brought horses, animal hides, and wool, exchanging them for tea, silk, and grain. Horses were particularly prized. China's armies relied on them, and the northern steppe produced animals far superior to anything bred in the fields of the south. The wall thus became the backdrop to centuries of negotiations, treaties, and compromises. Emperors might thunder about closing the frontier to outsiders, but the reality was more complicated. To survive, armies needed horses, and the horses grazed on northern pastures. The result was a border that oscillated between hostility and cooperation. There is a certain irony in the fact that the wall, often seen as a symbol of separation, was also a place of meeting. Markets sprouted near its gates. Envoys crossed through its passes, bearing tribute or demands. Monks and missionaries followed these same paths, carrying ideas alongside goods. Even raiders, once their attacks ended, sometimes lingered to trade. The wall, therefore, was less a simple barrier than a stage upon which a complicated dance of exchange unfolded. The structure itself changed over time. Early walls built from tamped earth rose during the Warring States period as local rulers sought to defend their territories. The Qin dynasty, famous for unifying China in the 3rd century BCE, linked many of these sections together. Later dynasties expanded and rebuilt, adding bricks, stone, and watchtowers. The Ming dynasty, facing fierce threats from Mongol horsemen, invested heavily in the wall, giving it much of the form we recognize today. Each iteration reflected not only military needs, but also economic and political realities. The deserts north of China shaped how effective the wall could be. In places, dunes stretched to the horizon, broken only by dry riverbeds. Here, the wall was less a continuous line and more a chain of outposts, space to guard oases and wells. Controlling water was as crucial as controlling gates. Whoever held the wells controlled the caravans, and whoever controlled the caravans controlled the wealth that flowed along them. The wall also functioned psychologically. To those within, it symbolized order, protection, and civilization. To those outside, it represented exclusion, but also opportunity. A high wall might deter a raid, but it also created fixed points of contact, predictable places where traders and envoys could approach. It set the terms of engagement, declaring in stone and earth where the border lay and how it could be crossed. Life along the wall was far from quiet. Garrisons of soldiers lived in its watchtowers, scanning the horizon for riders. Smoke signals by day and fire beacons by night allowed warnings to spread across hundreds of miles in hours. Farmers tilled the land nearby, their fields both feeding the garrisons and marking the settled side of the frontier. Markets bustled at designated gates, filled with goods that smelled of grasslands and deserts. The sound of neighing horses mixed with the murmur of bargaining voices, while the wall loomed above, its stones both separating and connecting the two worlds. Stories from these borderlands often capture the duality of the wall. Chronicles speak of fierce battles with nomadic horsemen clashing against Chinese defenders. Yet they also recount marriages between imperial families and nomadic leaders, treaties sealed with gifts of silk, and markets where both sides found what they needed. The line between enemy and partner was never fixed. It shifted like the sands of the desert, sometimes hostile, sometimes friendly, always interdependent. From a modern perspective, the Great Wall serves as a reminder that walls are rarely absolute. They may look solid, but in practice they are porous, shaped by geography, politics, and necessity. They can block armies, but they cannot stop the flow of ideas, nor can they prevent the slow trickle of trade that finds ways around or through. The Great Wall, for all its grandeur, was never a perfect seal. Instead, it was a regulator, shaping how the North and South interacted across centuries. There is even a touch of humor in thinking about how ineffective a wall can be when people on both sides are determined to trade. Imagine a watchtower soldier diligently scanning the horizon only to see merchants on either side bartering just beyond the gates, slipping goods through at the very moment he turns away. The wall was there, but human ingenuity and desire often found cracks within it, literal or metaphorical. Even after its decline as a military structure, the wall continued to shape memory and identity. It became a symbol of China's endurance and its capacity to build on a monumental scale. But behind the legend lies a more subtle truth. The wall was a place of encounter. It was a border where caravans paused, where envoys negotiated, and where cultures brushed against one another like riders meeting on a narrow pass. To stand before the Great Wall today is to see stone stretching across hills and ridges, following the contours of the land with patient determination. It is to imagine the soldiers who once kept watch, the merchants leading horses laden with grain, and the endless winds sweeping down from the steppe. It is to feel how geography, politics, and human need combined to create a frontier that was never just defense. The Great Wall reminds us that borders are not simply lines that divide. They're also points of connection, places where exchange and conflict, suspicion and cooperation coexist. In its stones are written not only the story of walls, but also the story of gates, of passes, and of the restless movement of people who, for all the obstacles, always find a way to meet. Across Africa, long before the arrival of European colonizers and colonial railways, a network of trails once tied together kingdoms, forests, savannas, and coastlines. They were not always monumental in appearance, often just beaten earth paths through grasslands or narrow tracks cutting into forest. But they carried immense significance. They moved gold from West African rivers, ivory from East African plains, and salt from desert mines. They were the arteries of African kingdoms, quiet threads that stitched together vast and varied landscapes. In West Africa, gold lay at the heart of many of these trails. Deposits along the Niger River and in the forests of what is now Ghana, Mali, and Guinea glittered with a wealth that caught the attention of the wider world. Traders carried nuggets and dust along footpaths and across savannas, linking mining communities with bustling markets. The gold of West Africa found its way to the Mediterranean, eventually feeding the treasuries of Islamic caliphates and later European courts. Towns like Gao and Djenné grew prosperous as nodal points where river traffic met overland caravans. The Niger River itself, bending in a great arc across the region, was less a barrier than a guide, carrying boats filled with goods, ideas, and travelers. The savannah was the stage for this trade. Unlike the dense rainforest to the south or the deserts to the north, the open grasslands allowed movement on foot and by pack animal. Caravans threaded their way between villages, pausing at wells and crossing seasonal rivers. Geography shaped the flow. Where rivers converged, markets flourished. Where routes crossed, towns emerged. And the savannah was not empty land, but a web of paths carved by repetition and memory. The great empires of the region, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, drew their strength from controlling these trails. By taxing the movement of goods and ensuring the safety of travelers, rulers transformed geography into power. Salt from the Sahara, copper from the desert fringes, and cloth from local weavers joined the flow of gold. Timbuktu became famous not only as a market town, but also as a center of scholarship, where manuscripts and learning traveled along the same paths as ivory and leather. It was proof that ideas as much as minerals were traded across the savannah. Farther east, another network unfolded, linking the African interior to the Swahili coast. Here, forests and plains provided resources that fed into the Indian Ocean trade. Ivory, carved into ornaments and exported as far as China, was one of the most valuable exports. Gold from the interior of present-day Zimbabwe and Mozambique made its way to coastal cities like Kilwa, where it was exchanged for textiles, ceramics, and beads from Asia. The great stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe, still standing in the hills of southern Africa, speak to the wealth generated by these inland-to-coast routes. The geography of East Africa dictated these movements. Rivers like the Zambezi and Limpopo offered natural corridors for travel, while savannas provided grazing land for cattle and staging grounds for caravans. Yet the routes were rarely straightforward. Dense forests, seasonal flooding, and disease made journeys hazardous. Traders relied on local knowledge, moving goods in stages from one community to the next until they reached the coast. There, the Swahili city-states became gateways between Africa and the wider Indian Ocean world. The Swahili coast itself was a marvel of connectivity. Towns like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar thrived on coral shores, their houses built of stone, their mosques rising above crowded markets. From these ports, dhows sailed with the monsoon winds to Arabia, India, and beyond. The goods they carried, ivory, gold, slaves, and animal hides, were the product of countless inland trails, each step linking a hunter, a miner, or a herdsman with distant markets across the sea. The rhythm of the monsoon connected the coast to the wider world, but the interior routes gave it the raw material to trade. What makes these African trails particularly fascinating is how they combined with rivers to shape life. Rivers were highways when in flood and lifelines when dry. The Nile, flowing northward through deserts, linked Central Africa with Egypt, carrying goods that would astonish Mediterranean merchants. The Congo River, winding through dense forests, created a different sort of world, one where canoes glided under leafy canopies and trails followed bends in the water. In the Niger Basin, people timed their movements to the rise and fall of water, the geography itself setting the tempo of exchange. For all their importance, many of these routes have slipped from memory. Unlike the stone roads of Rome or the monumental walls of China, they left little visible trace. Footpaths vanish under grass, wooden bridges rot away, and markers crumble. Yet the impact they had on the societies they connected was profound. They enabled kingdoms to rise, facilitated the spread of Islam into West Africa, and linked the heart of the continent to distant shores. The humor of history can be found in the irony of the word lost. These routes were never truly lost to the people who used them. Local communities continued to walk them, to guide cattle along them, to paddle rivers and carry baskets from one market to another. It is only to outsiders searching for stone and monument that they seem invisible. In truth, they were woven into the daily lives of countless people who never thought of themselves as part of a great route at all, but who nevertheless sustain one of the world's most vibrant systems of exchange. The decline of these networks came with shifting global patterns. As maritime routes grew dominant in the 15th and 16th centuries, and as European powers carved coastal enclaves, the inland trails lost some of their prominence. Yet they did not disappear entirely. Caravans still moved across savannas. Ivory still found its way to the coast, and rivers still carried goods long after ocean-going ships had begun to dominate. The trails adapted, just as they always had, to the rhythms of geography and need. To imagine them today is to picture a caravan of porters moving under the wide African sky, balancing baskets of gold dust or ivory tusks on their heads. It is to see the slow meander of canoes along a river bank or the flicker of torches in a market town at dusk. It is to hear the songs of traders as they walk, the lowing of cattle in the savannah, and the mingling of voices in coastal cities where Arabic, Swahili, and Portuguese once met. The lost trails of Africa remind us that not all trade routes were paved with stone or marked by grand monuments. Some were paths through grass, some were rivers glinting in the sun. Some were little more than memory carried in the mind of a guide. Yet together they built kingdoms, sustained economies, and linked Africa to a wider world. They were quiet trails, but they carried treasures that shaped continents, proof that history's greatest roads are not always those most visible to the eye. Every road has its season. For centuries, camel caravans trudged across deserts, ships hugged coastlines guided by monsoons, and footpaths wound patiently through forests and savannas. But the story of trade is also a story of change. Old routes, once the lifelines of kingdoms, gradually lost their power. Some were eclipsed by faster and safer paths, others by the arrival of entirely new technologies. What had been bustling arteries fell silent, leaving behind only faint traces, the grooves of cartwheels in stone, the outlines of forgotten inns, or the memory of footsteps buried under sand. One of the great turning points came with the age of oceanic exploration. In the 15th century, sailors from Portugal and Spain pushed beyond familiar coasts, learning to harness winds and currents that carried them around Africa and across the Atlantic. The sea offered something caravans could never match: scale. A single ship could carry as much cargo as hundreds of camels, and it could do so in weeks rather than months. The discovery of new sea routes shifted the geography of trade from narrow trails across land to broad shipping lanes across oceans. Goods that had once trickled slowly through oases or mountain passes now surged into ports by the ton. For the old overland routes, this was a slow death. The Silk Road, which for centuries had bound China, Central Asia, and Europe together, declined as maritime trade rose. The caravans still moved for a time, their bells jingling across deserts, but they carried fewer loads. A merchant in Venice or Lisbon no longer needed to rely on middlemen stretching across half a continent. Ships could sail directly to India for pepper or to China for porcelain, cutting out entire chains of overland exchanges. The monsoon winds, once known mainly to Arab and Indian sailors, became global engines of commerce. The rise of European colonial powers accelerated the eclipse. Fortified ports sprang up in Malacca, Calicut, Goa, and Zanzibar, places where naval cannon replaced caravan guards and where harbors bustled while inland towns dwindled. The geography of wealth shifted outward, away from dusty trails and toward seacoasts. Cities that once flourished at the crossroads of land routes, Samarkand, Timbuktu, Kashgar, found themselves sidelined, their markets shrinking as ships diverted trade elsewhere. The Industrial Revolution deepened this transformation. Railways with their iron tracks and steam engines carved new lines across continents. They outpaced caravans and rendered many footpaths obsolete. In India, the British built railways that linked interior cities to coastal ports, bypassing the slow networks of riverboats and pack animals. In Africa, colonial railways shifted trade flows, drawing goods to European-controlled harbors. The camel and the ox cart could not compete with the whistle of steam, the endless rhythm of wheels on rails. Modern shipping magnified the shift still further. By the 19th and 20th centuries, massive steamships and later container vessels turned the oceans into conveyor belts of global trade. A camel could carry perhaps 200 pounds across a desert. A modern ship could carry hundreds of thousands of tons across oceans. Geography itself seemed rewritten. Deserts that once mattered as crossing points became empty barriers, while harbors deep enough for large ships became the new centers of the world. Some routes vanished almost entirely. The incense trails of Arabia fell silent as cheaper substitutes replaced frankincense and myrrh. The Amber Road dwindled once new sources of gemstones and glass filled markets. The great salt caravans across the Sahara shrank as modern transport carried minerals more efficiently, and refrigeration reduced dependence on preserved meat. In some places, trails that had echoed with footsteps for centuries became little more than lines of memory, fading into the sand or hidden under plowed fields. Yet the disappearance of these old roads does not mean they were unimportant. On the contrary, their very decline highlights how dynamic human movement has always been. Trade routes are like rivers. When the flow shifts, old channels dry up, but their imprint remains on the landscape. The outlines of caravanseries in the Andes are still woven, if now for heritage rather than empire. In medieval towns, streets still curve where pilgrims once passed. Beneath modern highways, traces of Roman paving stones still lie, silently enduring the weight of lorries and cars above. There is something quietly haunting about these forgotten trails. Imagine standing in a desert where once 1,000 camels passed, hearing only the hiss of wind over sand. Or walking through a forest where footpaths once bustled with porters, now reclaimed by roots and birdsong. Beneath modern cities, too, roots endure in ghostly form. Many of today's highways and rail lines follow the logic of older paths, built where the land allowed or where people had long chosen to pass. The present often rests invisibly upon the foundations of the past. The silence of these lost roads invites reflection. They remind us that nothing in trade is permanent, that every network has its rise and fall. Geography itself plays a role. Rivers shift course, forests advance or retreat, climates change. Human innovation compounds it. Ships, rails, trucks, and planes redraw the map again and again. What once required months of hardship now takes hours of flight. A path that was once the beating heart of an empire may today be a quiet ruin, visited only by archaeologists or herders passing by. There's also an element of gentle humor in this story. Consider how much human effort once went into moving a single bale of cloth across half a continent, only for modern logistics to deliver dozens of packages to your door with the click of a button. The contrast is almost absurd, yet it underscores the continuity of desire. People always wanted spices, silks, metals, and stories from elsewhere. The routes may change, but the longing for connection remains constant. If the great caravans and fleets of the past have faded, their echoes still shape our world. Languages, cuisines, religions, and even genes carry traces of those ancient exchanges. When you taste cinnamon in a pastry, wear cotton spun far from where you live, or listen to a story rooted in distant lands, you're walking ghostly stretches of those forgotten roads. They're quieter now, buried under cities or erased by time. But their influence lingers in the global world we inhabit. The eclipse of the old roads was not an end, but a transformation. The camel trails of the Sahara became the shipping lanes of the Atlantic. The footpaths of the savannah gave way to railway lines. The Silk Road's oases dimmed, but the idea of East and West connected endured, reborn in new forms. In their silence, these trails remind us of the impermanence of movement and the persistence of memory. To imagine them now is to stand at the edge of a forgotten caravan route. Feel the emptiness of sand stretching into the horizon, and realize that under your feet lies centuries of footsteps. The world has moved on. The traffic shifted elsewhere, but the earth remembers. In that quiet remembrance, there is a kind of poetry. The roads may be gone, but their stories still travel. The story of forgotten trade routes is in the end a story of threads. Across deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas, people spun invisible lines between one place and another, weaving together a tapestry of connection that has always bound the world. Some of these threads were bright and famous, like the Silk Road or the spice routes, while others were faint, known only to the people who walked them, carried baskets along them, or paddled boats on their waters. Together they formed a web of movement that shaped civilizations, sustained empires, and carried not only goods but also ideas, languages, and faiths. What makes these routes so fascinating is how they were never accidents. Geography was always present, guiding, shaping, redirecting. Mountains dictated where passes could be built. Rivers decided where towns would grow. Winds in the Indian Ocean acted as seasonal timers, while deserts funneled caravans along narrow lines between oases. Even the ocean's currents offered their silent assistance, carrying ships onward or pushing them back. The earth itself was never passive in this story. It was the stage manager, setting the conditions under which human ambition could succeed or fail. And yet, despite all the difficulties geography imposed, people persisted. They built roads of stone across the Andes, rope bridges that swayed above torrents, inns where water was scarce, and harbors where reefs gave safe anchorage. They endured storms and blizzards, bandits and hunger, always moving forward because the need to connect outweighed the dangers. Trade routes remind us of the patience and resilience of humanity. of a willingness to walk for days or sail for months in search of something beyond the horizon. The goods they carried often seem humble by modern standards: salt, amber, fish, wool, or grain. Others, silk, ivory, spices, gold, shimmer in our imagination, symbols of luxury and desire. But each was important, and each carried weight far greater than its physical size. A pinch of salt could preserve a meal. A bolt of silk could fund an army. A bead of amber could signal wealth and prestige. Through these small things, entire societies were sustained. Perhaps even more powerful was the flow of ideas. Pilgrims carried their prayers along holy roads to shrines and cathedrals. Monks carried sutras across deserts. Merchants swapped gossip and news along with coin. From these encounters came blended languages, borrowed words, new recipes, and shared stories. Religion spread on the backs of caravans. Scientific knowledge moved from one culture to another. Even humor traveled. The jokes of sailors in Indian Ocean ports echoing the same wry tone as a shepherd telling tales at an oasis inn. It is tempting to imagine these roads as relics belonging to a world that has long since passed. Yet their legacy still lingers. Many of today's highways and railways follow the lines first etched by foot and hoof. Ports that thrived on monsoon winds still bustle with container ships, their geography unchanged even if the cargo is multiplied 1,000-fold. The roads may have been eclipsed, but they shaped the foundations of global trade, foundations that remain beneath the modern world. There's also a deeper reminder here that no path is permanent. Each road, no matter how busy, eventually faded when a faster, safer, or more efficient route appeared. The desert caravans dwindled when ships carried bulk cargo by sea. The railways drew life away from forest trails and river crossings. Aircraft finally bypassed them all, leaping over the geography that once dictated movement. But even as they fell silent, the old routes did not vanish entirely. They linger in memory, in ruins, in the faint lines visible from the air, or in the names of towns that were once crossroads. To reflect on these forgotten roads is to be reminded of the constant dance between human ingenuity and the natural world. Geography presents both obstacles and opportunities. People respond with creativity, building, adapting, rerouting. The result is a history not of linear progress, but of shifting patterns, roots rising and falling like tides. The earth shapes us, and in return we inscribe it with our movements. There is a kind of comfort in knowing that the desire to connect has always existed. Whether with camels, caravels, trains, or airplanes, people have always sought to reach one another, to share what they had, and to discover what lay beyond. These forgotten roots are reminders that isolation was never humanity's natural state. From the beginning, we have been wanderers, traders, storytellers, endlessly tying new knots into the fabric of the world. And so, as this journey comes to its quiet close, picture those roads once more. Picture the amber trails through northern forests, the incense caravans shimmering across Arabian sands, the llama paths winding along Andean ridges, the sea lanes stretching under stars and monsoons. Picture them as threads, some frayed, some broken, some still faintly humming beneath the earth. Together they form a web that is not gone but hidden, waiting patiently beneath the dust, the waves, and the silence of time. The roads may be forgotten, but they are not gone. They linger beneath the dust and waves, quiet as the